Presenting the scientific arguments, and I'm focusing on the arguments against legalization because it's the side that nobody hears about. There's a huge amount of money in favor of it. I appreciate everybody coming today. And as far as questions, let's try just asking questions if you have them. I've got a lot of information to present. If the questions take too long, then we can't do it that way. But let's see if it works because there's a lot of info to cover here. So this is basically what I'm going to go over. Marijuana in teenagers. I want to refute a lot of the myths about marijuana. And then I want to talk about medical marijuana and the marijuana industry and the research that they've generated that really needs to be questioned better. In this, the PowerPoint's available if you want to get it from Vicky. And in it, you'll see these little things down at the bottom where there's, anyway, little things in tiny print. What I did is I put the references there, but I didn't want them to clutter it up, so I put them really small. Anyway, I'm going to start. You've heard about me. I'm a psychiatrist. I've worked in jails, prisons, and homeless clinics. I'll also tell you I was a teenage marijuana user. It's probably why I'm so passionate about this. And I'm also a lifelong liberal Democrat, and it matters because everybody's partisan on this issue. I want you to know where I'm coming from. So, because I argue with my fellow liberals on this issue all the time. Anyway, let's start with the very beginning, which is teenage brain development. And this is the issue with marijuana. So this is brain development. There's really two phases to it, age 0 through 10, and then the teenage years. And it's totally different. So 0 through 10, what the brain does is every experience we have, it creates a new synapse. And that middle part of the picture there is a 7-year-old brain that's full of all sorts of connections and synapses. And then starting at age 11, what the brain does is what's called synaptic pruning or neural pruning. And it's totally different. What the brain does is it figures out what to keep and what to get rid of and strengthens it. I kind of look at it, it's like if you're writing something, first you get all your ideas down, and then you have to go through and edit it. So editing starts at age 11. And so some pathways are strengthened and refined, others are eliminated. And that picture on the right there is a 15-year-old brain, and you can see there's actually fewer connections in that brain, but they're much stronger. So the idea in synaptic pruning is use it or lose it. So whatever we do in our teenage years, we get really good at, because evolution has created us that during that time, the brain specializes in whatever we're going to do as adults. So if you're doing sports or into music, you'll get really good at it. This is why teenagers learn things really fast and remember it for the rest of their lives, because these skills become hardwired and permanent. So what happens when the teenage brain is using drugs during that period of development? Well, it will specialize and become expert at getting pleasure from addictive drugs. And normal pleasure and addictive pleasure are really quite different. So normal pleasure, happiness, comes from interactions with life. Time with friends, hearing stories, relationships, success, having a career and having success at it, mastering a skill, right? All the things that we do. I mean, I hate to reduce it to neurochemicals, but all these things that we do stimulate the pleasure centers of our brain. Some of them are very adult pleasures. But normal pleasure comes from being engaged with life. Addictive pleasure is very different. It comes from directly stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain. This is a rat with an electrode in the pleasure centers, and it will push that lever forever and ignore food, any other needs. It overrides all the normal paths. Drugs are basically a short circuit. They stimulate the pleasure centers. And so teenage drug users are spending less time engaged with life and more time directly stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain. So what does teenage brain development do? It strengthens the pathways for addictive pleasure, and then they lose some of the pathways for healthy pleasure. And this is permanent. Now, it's not total, but it's to some degree, and it actually shows up in the research. So this is a graph of how often people used marijuana in their teenage years. And that's down at the bottom. So on the left, it says never use marijuana, 1 to 100 times. And most of those people used less than 10 times. And then 100 to 200, 200 to 400, more than 400 times. And what you can see on this is, and they asked them at age 25, they had them do all these things. They rated their satisfaction with their intimate relationships. The more marijuana they used as a teenager, the less satisfaction they had with their relationships, the more dissatisfied with life they were in general. And that's because, I think we don't know this for certain, but that's probably because their brains are altered from the teenage marijuana use, and they lost some of that ability to get pleasure out of life. But they have more ability to get pleasure out of addictive drugs. So all teenage drug use, and I think this includes alcohol and tobacco, will hardwire the brain to get more pleasure from drugs and less pleasure from normal life, and this will be permanent, which is one of the big reasons everyone should be avoiding all addictive drugs until at least age 18. The other reason is addiction. The addictive drug industries, of course, know all about this, and they target teenagers because the developing brain is more prone to addiction. I don't know if I should stress it with this group, but often when I'm talking to people, I have to remind them, addiction is biological, it is hereditary. There's a lot of people who really don't like this. Certain people just hate the idea, partly because they want to blame addicts or insist that self-control works, but the research all points to the disease concept, and it's a lot easier to treat people that way. Anyway, a lot of marijuana users insist that marijuana is not addictive. I mean, people come to me because they can't stop smoking pot. That's pretty much says it's addictive. But there's a study done by Alex Budney back in '98, and he put an ad in the paper in Burlington, Vermont for people who couldn't stop marijuana, and he got a lot of responses. And they all had really typical symptoms of addiction. They continued to use despite having problems. They kept trying to quit or cut down. The biggest symptom of pot addicts is they spend all their money on marijuana. That's the one I hear all the time from them. And then they don't do things where they can't smoke pot or can't get high. And there's a withdrawal syndrome, which includes irritability and insomnia. Anyway, just a little bit about addiction. There's two ways to look at it. One way is how addictive is the drug? And as far as everybody who's used the drug even one time, 9% get addicted to marijuana. Alcohol's a little bit higher, 15%. Cocaine a little bit more. Heroin and tobacco are much more addictive. Now, it also depends on how often they use it. So, and how early they start using it. And those are the two big things with marijuana: how early in life they first use it and how often they used it. So all users, it's about 9%. Teenage users, 15% get addicted. These are the people who tried even once. All daily users, about 18% get addicted. And daily teenage users, fully a third of them get addicted. Then the other way to look at it is how many Americans are addicted to the drug. And this has to do with how widespread it is. So I didn't even put tobacco on this graph. Alcohol is by far the most addictive drug when you look at how many people are addicted to it in this country. And down there at the bottom is heroin, and we have an epidemic of heroin right now, but it's still dwarfed by these other drugs. When you look at kids under the age of 18, marijuana is the #1 drug of addiction these days. So that's one way that marijuana harms the teenage brain, is it strengthens the pathways for addictive pleasure, making them more prone to addiction. And all drugs in the teenage years do that. The second way that marijuana harms the teenage brain, and this is unique to marijuana. Marijuana is actually similar to the neurotransmitters that run teenage brain development. And so marijuana disrupts synaptic pruning. So people who are smoking marijuana in their teenage years, like some of us did, will have altered brain development. Some of the pathways that aren't used will remain, even though they're not being used in the teenage years. Some useful ones might be eliminated or else not myelinated and not reinforced well. And this shows up on brain scans. People use marijuana. All these studies are in fine print down here. People use marijuana as teenagers, have smaller brain, altered gray matter volumes. And the reason is the synaptic pruning. If that gets derailed, they might do too much pruning, in which case they'll have a smaller volume, or not enough pruning, in which case there'll be a larger volume. And also disorganized white matter, because they're not myelinating it correctly. And it really shows up in the corpus callosum, is people who are heavy marijuana users. It's really disorganized. But these changes are seen throughout the brains of teenage users. It's subtle change. But what I realized from this is people who smoke pot in their teenage years, especially early teenage years, are different. And, I knew when I quit smoking pot, something had changed a little bit. I didn't pay too much attention to it. I just thought the marijuana had to get out of my system. When I started studying this, I realized, oh no, I permanently altered. There's no going back to the way it was. And I've tried to spot with my patients. I try to guess ahead of time who used marijuana in their early teens, who didn't. I don't know if I can tell. But I think eventually we'll figure out how to do that. Anyway, using marijuana, there's no safe number of times for a teenager to use marijuana. There's a study that came out this year, and they looked at 46 teenagers who had used marijuana 1 or 2 times before the age of 14. That was it. And they could tell the difference on brain scan. They had larger gray matter volumes, and that's because it disrupted synaptic pruning. So there is, it's the big concern is teenage use, especially that early teenage use. That is really the big thing, but there's no safe amount, especially for kids, I would say under the age of 16, but we say 18. Okay, marijuana also affects the frontal lobes of the brain. It affects everything. The endocannabinoid system is throughout the brain. But the frontal lobes run executive function, which is our ability to think and plan and strategize, all these human things we do that allow us to make decisions and not kind of live like animals. And this gets affected by marijuana users. And you think about what it's like to live without good executive function, and you get the stereotype blissed out stoner who drifts through life. So this is actually kind of real. If teenagers damage their frontal lobes, there's going to be less ability for complex and strategic thinking. So not as much initiative in life, more willing to just kind of accept whatever happens. It's kind of that blissed out feeling. And the research on this. This is a study that was done at Harvard, and if you know the Stroop color test, it's a test of impulse control. So our normal tendency is when we see things to just read the word. And so you look at this, you go green, red, black, white. But in this test, what people are asked to do is say the color. And so you've got to suppress that impulse to read the word and think and then say the color. So it's a little harder to say blue, green, red, black. It just takes more effort to do that. And so they did the study and they compared marijuana users to non-marijuana users, and they found that the marijuana users did worse on this test. But then they divided them up, and they found out the ones who did worse on the test were the ones who started using marijuana before age 16. The ones who started after age 16 did fine on this test. Then they went and they did MRIs while they were doing the actual Stroop color test. And what they found is there were difference in all 3 groups. So on the left are the healthy controls, and you can see they used a certain amount of their brain to do this. Then the middle ones are the people who started using after age 16. They were able to do the test just fine, but as you can see, they used more of the brain to do it. So they have some damage, but they're able to compensate for it. And then on the right are the people who started using marijuana in their early teens. And they've done enough damage that they can't even try, and they can't even compensate for it. And that's why it shows up they can't even do the test very well. And so I've started asking my patients, one of the biggest questions I ask them about marijuana, I should ask them about every drug, what age did you start? But it's really important with pot. So I ask them, what age did you start? And if they say 12 to 13, something in my heart kind of sinks, because there is nothing we can do about it afterwards. Cigarettes in a way are very forgiving. They kill 500,000 people a year, but if you quit by age 30, the body pretty much cleans out from the damage that's done. Marijuana, on the other hand, using one time before the age of 14 has an effect that's just never going to go away. Okay, so what does this do? This is one of the studies that the author of this study is really fed up with being asked to speak on it because she gets so many hate calls from marijuana users. But she did a study and found that marijuana users who started in their teenage years lost some IQ, and the very heaviest users lost an average of 8 IQ points. And these are people who used heavily in their teens and continue to. 8 IQ points is actually quite a bit. So I'd say it's the difference between having kind of a hard time in college versus doing very well or doing well in graduate school. It's the difference between a food service job or a white collar job. And it's a big difference, being passed over for promotions at work. And the thing is, this study found the same thing about, because I think she had them stop using for a whole month and then tested them. And the people who started after age 18, IQ returned to normal. People who started before age 18, those are the ones who had the permanent loss. She got the criticisms they gave her all the time were, well, you didn't account for this factor. And so she would go back and account for all these different factors. And it's important to do that, because just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one causes the other. So she considered socioeconomic state, education, alcohol use. I mean, she went through more than a dozen different factors and still found lower IQ in the people who use marijuana in their teenage years. So I want to talk about marijuana denial for a little bit, because denial is a little bit different for each drug. I didn't quite realize that. I started back when alcohol was the only drug we dealt with, and I just thought that's what denial was like. But it turns out everybody's denial is different. So pot denial is, well, it didn't affect me. You know, it's only weed. It's harmless. It didn't. And so people will say this. They'll say, well, you know, I used it in my teens and it didn't hurt me. And that's denial, because the fact is it did. All of us who used in our teens have been affected by it, and we live with that today. People are not, you know, either they're not aware or they're in denial or both. But, you know, if somebody breaks their leg playing football as a teenager and it hurts 10 years later, they know exactly what happened. They know why. But if somebody doesn't get a promotion at work, they're not going to think, you know, it's that pot that I smoked as a teenager. But it's just as much of an injury. So I want to say that, you know, all of us who used in our teenage years have lost some degree of function. And, you know, I would have been a better doctor if I'd never smoked pot. I certainly would have had a much better college career. I mean, I dropped out for a while. I eventually went back. But I wish other people would say, you know, I wish, you know, they, in the past elections, they talked about Barack Obama's teenage use and Jeb Bush's teenage use. And I wish they would say, I wish Obama would say, I would have been a better president if I'd never smoked pot. I wish Jeb Bush would say, I would have been a better governor and maybe a better presidential candidate if I never smoked pot. Because it's actually probably true for all of us who use in our teenage years. And the reason to say it is teenagers need to hear adults saying this. Anyway, marijuana interferes with education. So, and in not very high amounts. You know, I ask my patients, well, how often do you smoke pot? And they say, oh, just occasionally, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And I go, well, actually, it stays in the body for 2 or 3 weeks. So if you smoke once a week, you've got metabolites all the time. They're not the most active metabolites, but it's a long-acting drug. So some of the research looked at high school and college students who smoked pot twice a month. And what they found is, I mean, more than twice a month, but some of them were just twice a month. But even the ones who just smoked pot twice a month did less homework, skipped more classes, got worse grades, and the biggest thing is dropping out more often. And this really is the dropout drug. There's no drug that increases the dropout rate like marijuana. Remember in the 60s and early 70s, it was what? Turn on, tune in, turn on, drop out. I think the dropout had more to do with the marijuana than the LSD. So there's a study that was done in 2000, and they looked at people who used marijuana regularly by the time they were 16, and they had more than twice the dropout rate. The other one, this study just came out a few years ago. In states that have medical marijuana laws, the high school dropout rate is 10% higher. Fewer of the students go to college. And of those who go, fewer finish college. And the thing is, states with medical marijuana laws actually have, the adults have higher rates of college degrees. So for their kids to be going to college less is really serious. But this information is not getting out. And I wish the parents would hear this. It's kind of a cute study that was done in Maastricht in Holland. It's this little city right on the border with Belgium and France, and they've got a lot of foreign students, and they do not like marijuana tourists in Holland. They realize it's not a good thing. And so the city of Maastricht banned all marijuana sales to foreigners, including their foreign students. They had a lot of foreign students. And then somebody did a study of what happened. And what they found is that the students, their dropout rate decreased and their grades improved, especially for classes that involved math. Whereas the local students from Holland, no effect. Okay, this is a study, this came out of Australia, and they looked at, Australia has, it's the same, I showed you a graph from the study before, it's the same thing. People who never used pot, people used it 1 to 100 times, and this is all before the age of 18, how often they used it. 200, 300, more than 400 times. How many times did you use marijuana before the age of 18? And then at age 25, how many of them had a college degree? And it just slopes downhill. Now, part of this is not causative. Part of it is that people who are going to go to college are less likely to use marijuana. But part of this is causative. It goes from 36% down to 2%. It's pretty dramatic. The same study, this is the odds of being on welfare or being unemployed at some time in your life before age 25. And for the heaviest marijuana users, 3 times as likely to be unemployed or on welfare. And this is the one that bothers teenagers the most. What are the odds? And this is income. People who smoke pot in their teenage years regularly earn about 15 to 20% less as adults. Also, there's research that they are less likely to get married. People who smoke marijuana as teenagers. So I've gone over that. The issue that's really coming out now is the issue of schizophrenia. And the reason is this has really come to the fore with the high potency marijuana that's being sold in dispensaries. When I was a kid and we smoked pot, it was 1 or 2% THC. Now you can get 15, 20, 25%. You can get pure THC. And it works very, very differently, so I'm told. I don't really want to find out. So when I talk about schizophrenia, we talk about psychosis. Some studies call it psychosis, schizophrenia. They talk about schizophrenia-like illnesses. It really is, I think, the worst of all the non-fatal diseases because it starts in the late teens or early 20s, and it just destroys people's lives. It permanently deranges their thinking. If you work with this, they're dependent on medicine. They're dependent on the community mental health center. They rarely have full-time jobs, rarely married, rarely have their own home. The cause of schizophrenia is synaptic pruning gone awry. This is not proved, but it's considered pretty likely, which is why it occurs in the late teens. And marijuana interferes with neural pruning. So marijuana has a horrible effect on schizophrenia. And anybody who works with schizophrenics has seen this. When they use marijuana, they really decompensate. And that's because marijuana actually imitates the process that causes schizophrenia. So there's 3 things that we see with schizophrenic patients. One is, if they already have schizophrenia, pot will make them worse. The other is that people who use marijuana develop schizophrenia 2 to 3 years younger on the average than people who don't use pot. And now there's enough evidence that marijuana actually causes schizophrenia in people who would not have developed it otherwise. This one's been controversial. So let's go over these. Schizophrenic patients who use marijuana, they are less likely to take their medicine. They're more likely to drop out of treatment. They're more likely to end up hospitalized. The United States spends over $1 billion a year on schizophrenic hospitalizations caused by marijuana. This one report said about half the expense of hospitalizing schizophrenics is due to marijuana, and that was done years ago, probably worse today. So I really I always tell patients with schizophrenia, you got it, absolutely don't use it. No drugs, no alcohol, and you'll stay functioning. Second, marijuana users develop schizophrenia earlier, and this was a meta-analysis that was done. They took all the different studies and used really strict ways of combining the data, and what they found is marijuana users were diagnosed 2 or 3 years younger, especially the heaviest users. Alcohol did not have any such effect. So the big question is, does marijuana cause schizophrenia? And actually, when I wrote the book, I said, we don't know. I was really wrong at the time. We did know, but the evidence wasn't as strong as it is now. Although the biggest study came out, this is a study from 1987. It was a huge study. It was 50,000 military conscripts in Sweden, and they just happened to have the data on them. So somebody looked through it. And what they found is the marijuana users were more likely to, people who use marijuana, it's the same story. The people who use marijuana before the age of 18 were more likely to develop schizophrenia later in life. The heaviest users were 6 times more likely. Well, then they went back and they controlled for all those third factors, those confounding factors. They looked at socioeconomic status, a family history of schizophrenia, and it still came out. The heaviest users were 3 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. And the World Psychiatric Congress came out recently and just said there's enough evidence cannabis use during puberty is a major risk factor for developing schizophrenia. In London, they said the high-potency cannabis was involved in 24% of all first episode psychosis. And I find, now that I know what it is, I read Alex Berenson's book, where he really describes it. Now that I know what it is, I realize I see this all the time. And I'm going to go over it. There's a future slide. Go over the difference. Anyway, the arguments against the development of schizophrenia world, and why aren't we seeing a whole lot more of this? And I asked a researcher about this, and she says, how do we know? We don't keep count. It's all estimates. In Denmark, where they do keep count, there's been a 30% increase in schizophrenia or in psychosis. And ER visits for first psychosis have gone up in this country. And the other argument is that, well, it's a third factor that causes this. Genetics, the same genetics that cause schizophrenia also cause people to use marijuana. So that's what's doing it. And that's pretty much been proved wrong with the studies on the high potency weed, because what we found is it's the people who use the really high potency marijuana that are way more likely to develop psychosis. And the genetics don't predispose them to choose that. They choose that because it's available. When it wasn't available in the world, nobody used it. As it's become more available, people are using it. So both of these arguments against it are pretty much gone. The high potency marijuana, skunk weed, it's a hybrid between sativa and indica. People use skunk. This is research, it's hard for me to read this, done in 2009, 2015, British Journal of Psychiatry and Lancet. People who use the high potency marijuana, 4 to 5 times more likely to develop psychosis. And a lot of the psychosis goes on to be schizophrenia. And the ones who develop psychosis are the ones who have used more than 5 years, but especially who used daily and who use the really high potency marijuana, which is not what you get in dispensaries. The dispensary marijuana is much higher potency than stuff that people bought from Mexico. And this is just the graph they showed. Of all the people who developed psychosis, the one in red is the ones using high potency. Of all the people who didn't develop psychosis, the majority were the people not using high potency marijuana. So we've actually created a new illness. And like I said, I see this at work. And you all who work with people with schizophrenia can probably realize you've been seeing this. And here's the difference. When you see somebody with conventional schizophrenia, they have those typical symptoms of disorganized thought, loose associations, tangential thinking, whereas marijuana-induced schizophrenia, their thought is more organized. Conventional schizophrenia, more denial, a lot more resistance to medication. I find my patients who developed it in the midst of smoking marijuana never fight me on medicine. They tell me the diagnosis right up front. The bizarre delusions we normally saw in schizophrenia, thought withdrawal, thought broadcasting, thinking other people can read my thoughts. I don't see those in the people with marijuana-induced schizophrenia. The biggest difference is, it used to be my big diagnostic thing for people with schizophrenia is I just felt weird talking to them. It's like they're relating to a different dimension, and I'm not in that dimension. And that's how it feels. With people with marijuana-induced schizophrenia, it feels like they're all there. And the other thing is people with more traditional schizophrenia had true paranoia. People with marijuana-induced schizophrenia, it's more that they're quarrelsome and antagonistic as opposed to really paranoid. I also find they're really attached to marijuana, and I tell them this caused your disease, and they don't hear, and they don't want to quit. And I've seen a lot of these people. I see about 1 or 2 a month, and often the story is they first used marijuana like at 11 or 12, and then developed schizophrenia within a few years later, and they never put the two together. the teenagers who are genetically predisposed to schizophrenia because it runs in their family are, of course, especially vulnerable. How many teenagers check their family history before trying marijuana? I sure didn't. And if schizophrenia runs in your family, do you really want somebody telling your teenager that pot is safer than alcohol? Probably not. But really committed marijuana users are in denial. It can't hurt me. It's only weed. And this is an article that showed up in High Times magazine. Smoke weed and don't worry about schizophrenia. It's this unshakable belief that marijuana can't hurt anyone. The other thing pot causes is depression and suicide. These pictures are all people, their parents post them, all people who committed suicide, pretty much blamed on marijuana. And I'm just going to go through some of the studies, and it's all kind of the same story. Regular users, people who started in their early teens, have more depression and more suicide attempts. What I find with people with depression, when I hear the story that they started smoking marijuana and became depressed afterwards, and I tell them, they're very open to quitting. I mean, they quit right away. There's very little denial there. But again, another study, this was in 2003, marijuana use is linked to depression, especially early teen use and regular use. This Australian study that looked at 1,600 teenage girls from age 13 to 20, and what they found is the ones who used daily were 5 times as likely to report depression. But the high rate of suicide is even a bigger deal. So this is a study from JAMA Psychiatry. People use marijuana, and they lumped occasional and heavy users together, which they really shouldn't do. But anyway, all users were 30% more likely to develop depression as adults, but 3 times more likely, which is 200% more likely to attempt suicide as adults. And another study, daily marijuana use before the age of 17, 7 times as likely to attempt suicide. And this is actually a big deal. And this is a graph of suicides where the person was positive for marijuana on autopsy, age 20 and older in Colorado. The green line is when they began their marijuana dispensaries for medical marijuana. The yellow one is. And then the green one is when legalization started. And it's really it's tripled in those years that they made marijuana more available in Colorado. So the link to suicide is actually very strong. And this is just a news story that's come out recently, came out last month. Suicide rate for teenage girls hits a 40-year high. And they don't know why. And this is what the graph looks like. This is girls age 13 to 15. And it's not the boys so much, it's the girls. And starting 2010, it really started going up. And it's doubled, which is kind of shocking. And I just want you to look at these 2 graphs. That's the graph of suicides, girls aged 13 to 15. This is a graph of marijuana positive suicides in teenagers in Colorado. And yeah, it dropped in those years, but in 2010, it went up and it tripled. There's all this discussion online, if you look for it, why are our girls killing themselves? And they look at all these possibilities. They don't ask about marijuana. And I don't know if marijuana plays a role in this, but it should be considered. Marijuana also increases suicide in people who start as adults. So in veterans with marijuana abuse, attempted suicide twice as often, and they try to count for everything: PTSD, depression, alcohol and drug use, combat exposure, all those things. Taking account into all those things, the marijuana still doubled their rate of suicide attempts. And it does this in people with psychosis and people without psychosis. It's not just related to the psychosis. And there's this weird syndrome with marijuana where people become suddenly suicidal and act on it immediately. And you'll hear these stories about people who just, they don't talk to anybody, they just do it. I saw one patient talk about it in jail who did this. He failed, but he just could not figure out why he became suicidal like that. Okay, marijuana and violent behavior. And this is often the hardest one for people to believe, but it's really quite well documented. And people will say, well, I use pot and I never got violent. And the thing is, that's the whole marijuana denial thing, because nobody will say, well, I've had a drink and I never drove drunk and killed somebody. That doesn't mean nobody else does. Or, nobody would ever say, well, I took oxycodone once for pain and I didn't get addicted, so this doesn't happen. Nobody would say that. And the reason is, we know that opioids are addictive, and we know that drunk driving is dangerous, not really from our personal experience, but through the news media. As Will Rogers said, everything I know is what I read. All I know is what I read in the papers. And the news media is not reporting on marijuana and violence. In fact, they report terribly on marijuana. And this whole issue, the reason this is an issue is news outlets allow marijuana users to report on this issue or to dictate what gets covered. And there's a study of the news media coverage of medical marijuana, and what they found is the stories were 6 times more likely to be positive as negative, and even the negative ones were more about that it's confusing rather than that it's a bad idea. The news coverage for marijuana has been overwhelmingly positive. And so people aren't going to hear about this. In fact, what I like to say is if the press had covered this well, we wouldn't have a single medical marijuana or legalization law in this country. Anyway, here's a study that was done in 2016. Regular marijuana users convicted of violent crimes at 7 times the rate of non-users. Yes, it is involved in violence. Not everyone has a drink of alcohol becomes violent, but we know that some do. Mental illness, people with schizophrenia, the violence is mostly due to substance abuse. Schizophrenics without substance abuse, maybe twice the rate of violence. With substance abuse, 9 times the rate of violence. Regular teenage marijuana users, people who use marijuana in their teen years, especially the early teen years, when they're adults, they're twice as likely to perpetrate domestic violence. Okay, the next couple stories are kind of grisly and they're just stories, but they're really important because this is happening. This is what's in Alex Berenson's book. So I got this one out. Lionel Richie's bassist stabs himself repeatedly after ingesting edibles, marijuana edibles. Paramedics rushed to a San Fernando Valley apartment where they found Ethan Farmer bleeding profusely. Farmer had eaten either pot brownies or cookies and went off the rails. The 42-year-old had some friends over and they were chowing down on edibles when Farmer suddenly turned violent on himself. And this is not that uncommon a story. When I worked in the jail, I didn't see people who hurt themselves, but I did see people who hurt others. More similar to this story. Accused killer told cops that bong hits led to violent episode. This is a woman who tried marijuana for the first time with her new boyfriend and felt she was dying. And I remember as a teenager getting a friend of mine stoned once who actually had this reaction. Fortunately, she didn't do the rest of it. She just felt that she was dying. This person went on. She then believed that she was dead and had to hurt her boyfriend to bring herself back to life. She began stabbing him, hearing voices saying the violence would bring her back to life. He died with 108 stab wounds. Then the voices told her to stab herself, and she stabbed her neck several times, requiring emergency surgery. I worked in the county jail, and I'm just going to tell you about a couple of people I saw because I read Alex Berenson's book, and I started, I've seen this. When I worked there, I saw, most of the people with violence, meth was the biggest drug for violence. But the typical meth addict in jail has been arrested 10 times. Everybody knows his first name, and he's back. The typical marijuana patient in jail for violence has never committed a crime in his life and is shocked at what they did. So I actually saw a patient who had killed his girlfriend and his dogs and cut off his own arm under the influence of marijuana. Never been arrested for anything before. I saw a guy in his mid-20s who lived in a state where they didn't have a medical marijuana law. He smoked marijuana all the time there. Moved to Arizona where we had medical marijuana. He started getting this high-potency weed from the dispensaries, and he committed an armed robbery. And I saw him in jail, and he did not know why he did it. I saw this guy who's a computer programmer, full-time job, but he was smoking dispensary weed all the time, and he stabbed and killed his stepfather. And then I saw somebody else who he was smoking dispensary weed, became suddenly suicidal, decided to kill himself, drove his car into somebody else, killed the person he drove into, didn't kill himself. And he kept saying, I've never been suicidal. He'd never had any psychiatric treatment in his life. He just could not understand why he did that. And that's a common thing that I see with this. I mean, it's not that common a thing, but if you work in a jail, I realized in 1 year in jail, I saw those 4 cases. So it's not that uncommon. The problem is when violence gets reported in the press, often the drugs don't get reported. And we know most violence has to do with drugs and alcohol, but just usually the press doesn't cover it. So here's the last one. These people have two things in common. They've been in the news for high-profile mass killings and heavy marijuana use, and I'm just going to go through them. From the bottom left, Jared Loughner, who killed 6 people in Arizona and wounded Representative Gabrielle Giffords, became schizophrenic in the midst of heavy marijuana use in high school. Keisha Holloway drove into a crowd in Las Vegas, killed 1 person high on marijuana. Randall Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado movie shooter, it's debatable. Some of the news stories I've read said he didn't use drugs, but others said that he did use drugs, and especially marijuana. Devin Patrick Kelly, who killed 26 people at a Texas Baptist church, they found marijuana and other drugs in his system. He had a past charge for marijuana possession. Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people in Charleston, South Carolina, was a regular marijuana user, also used other drugs. The Sonarov brothers, the Boston Marathon bombers, both were heavy marijuana users, and Robert Louis Deere, Planned Parenthood shooter, regular marijuana users. So, anecdotal evidence, but I think this connection is very real. I think the epidemic of mass killings, it's been on the increase. It might have as much to do with the drugs that are available now as with the easy availability of guns. And this is one part of it we're not focusing on. I just want to mention Alex Berenson's book, Tell Your Children. He's a New York Times investigative reporter. He wrote a really good book on marijuana and violence. He's getting a lot of criticism and pushback from people on this. But I just wanted to mention this. So let me just summarize this. Teenage marijuana use is associated with altered brain microstructure, permanent, worse school performance, higher dropout rate, less college attendance, less graduation, worse strategic thinking, less likely to marry, less pleasure from life, earn less as adults, lower IQ, more prone to addiction, schizophrenia, depression, suicide, violence. And the two things, there's just no safe amount for teenage users, and it's especially harmful for people who use in their early teenage years or who use regularly. There aren't any questions. Are there any? Yes.
Well, you said that you criticized both the recreational use and dispensaries, and I agree with certainly the way that dispensaries often work on them. But you didn't seem to make a space for that there may be some appropriate medical use for marijuana.
Yeah, the later part of this talk is going to be about medical marijuana. Yeah, and I'm going to go over that. Although it's surprisingly little, but it's definitely there. It's kind of the same way. Prohibition of alcohol was kind of saved by the social drinkers, even though heavy alcoholic drinkers consume most of it. The small amount of medical use is kind of what saves it. Yes. Yeah. Oh, let me just say, that question before was the question about medical marijuana. The connection to bipolar, yeah, and I'll go over that. I'll mention that soon. It's not much. What it says is that marijuana, the National Association of Medicine, what used to be the Institute of Medicine, did a whole report, and they said one of the things is that marijuana makes bipolar disorder worse. Doesn't cause it, although I suspect it does. I've got one patient who's diagnosed bipolar, and it started in her early teen years, which is unusual, and in the midst of marijuana use. But it definitely makes bipolar worse. Yes?
When they tell you it helps you feel better, your response is?
It's the disease talking. Yeah, well, patients will tell me, I'll get into this more, patients will say that marijuana helps me. I go, the research says that it doesn't, but people who have an addiction, like addictive drugs, you'll probably do better when you get off. And my patients always do better when they get off. Yeah, the question is, back in the 1980s, there's all this negative stuff about marijuana, and is it today a backlash that they're not covering it? Partly, but I actually think the reason it's happening now is that, And what happened, and by the way, I'm going to show what happened in the 80s with all that coverage actually did work. But I think what's happening now is that a lot of people in the press are pro-legalization, and they use marijuana, and they don't want to put down anything negative about it. But a lot of people who don't use marijuana still have adopted that attitude. And I think it's kind of an excuse that it used to be covered poorly. They should still be covering good news reports. A lot of these studies, I'm going to go through this in a little bit, really bad studies that support marijuana get huge press coverage, whereas a study that shows something negative gets no coverage at all. So
Enough studies, just because it remains illegal federally, that we don't have federal funding to do enough studies on it because it remains a Schedule I drug.
the question is there enough studies because it's a Schedule I drug? Actually, there's lots of studies done with marijuana. Those would be the studies using marijuana for medical purposes. Like the research I'm talking about here doesn't require marijuana. You just need marijuana users, but however they've used it. People who want to do research on cannabinoids have usually been able to do it. I don't totally buy this argument that they can't get the marijuana to do their studies, and that's why we don't know about it, because the studies are being done. Yes.
Is there any recent data on, Colorado legalized, but what it does to the kids who grow, smaller children who maybe never themselves use marijuana, but their parents are active marijuana users, how that impacts their life, like more of a, secondhand.
A secondhand smoker, or what's it like to grow up with an alcoholic parent, in a sense? Yeah. I don't know of anything on that. There's so much done on adult children of alcoholics. And I don't know about adult children of potheads, adult children of heroin addicts. I don't really, I see these people, but I don't really know.
I just wondered, because of the parents maybe not being, present, they don't want to go get the puzzle, they don't want to interact with the child, it's got to have an impact, and then, secondhand smoke, are they getting a contact type from being in the home type of thing? Just developmentally.
Yeah, what's the big thing that's happened to kids in Colorado is they have these marijuana edibles and kids are eating them. And so ER visits and poison control, those have gone way up. Okay, anything else? I'm going to do the next part, and then we're going to take a break in the middle, if that's okay. Let me do this next part. It'll be slightly shorter. Let's see how I set this up. Okay, so I'm going to go over the myths because there's a lot of misinformation, and I just want to go through these. And this is not so much, this doesn't really affect you clinically, but it sure helps in talking to people about it. So the biggest myth is that jails and prisons are filled with marijuana users, and that legalizing pot would end mass incarceration. And I just want to point out, this is from Bureau of Justice Statistics, who's actually in prison. Half of all people in prison, both federal and state, are in for violent crimes. That's in the United States. Property crime is about 16%. That's things like theft and burglary. The violent is mostly assault. Drug crime is 18%, although as we'll see, almost all of it is drug dealers. Public order crime like DUI is 15%. So 18% are in for drug crimes. If we released all drug criminals, we would still have mass incarceration. But the question is, who are these 18%? And there's a study that was done, it came out in 2005, and these researchers wanted to figure out how many people are in prison just for drug possession, not anything else. And in 1997, there was a survey done of 18,000 inmates in the United States, and they used all that data. And they went through it, and they found that of that 18%, 80 to 90% were in for drug sales, 10 to 20% were in for possession plus another crime, an assault and a burglary, and only 2 to 3% were solely in for drug possession, which is fewer than 1% of all prison inmates. So They say drug users in prison, if we release the people who are just in for drug possession, it wouldn't change the prison population significantly at all. And marijuana was only 5 to 7% of that. So let me look at the raw numbers on this. So this is what they came up with. 274,000 people in for drug crimes in 1997. 100,000 had drug possession conviction. And that's the number that we hear. But they looked through their stuff and they found that most of those people were actually convicted of possession with intent to sell, or they had possession plus another crime that they were in there for. And when they eliminated those, it got down to 20,000. And then they looked through and said, well, how many of these people pleaded down from something more serious? Or it was a drug that they themselves didn't use, which is a really common thing with drug dealers. If you're a drug user, you really don't want a drug user as your dealer, because they're more likely to rip you off. You want somebody who doesn't use it. When I worked in the prison, all the drug dealers I met did not use the drugs. So they eliminated those people, and it came down to 7,000 out of the 1.5 million who were just in prison for drug possession alone. And of course, 5% are marijuana, that's 400. So that's the best estimate we have. In 1997, there were approximately 400 people in prison solely for possession of marijuana. And I met one of these people when I worked in prison. And what they say is, you got to work really hard to go to prison for drug possession in this country. And he did. He smoked pot outdoors in his apartment complex, and the neighbors complained because it was around the kids, and they would call the police and he'd get arrested, and they wouldn't, didn't do very much. And he told me after the 10th time he got arrested, the judge said, I am going to make you serve some time. And he planned on doing the same thing when he got out. There are people like that. Anyway, the idea that prisons are filled with marijuana users is a myth. I just want to make that clear. But we hear about this. So I worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign, but she made this statement. She got it basically that huge population in our prisons for nonviolent, low-level offenses primarily due to marijuana. Totally untrue. Washington Post gave her 4 Pinocchios. But politicians, Rand Paul says this all the time too. Politicians on both sides say it. Here's the New York Times, which is their editorial page is quite pro-marijuana. And they had this article, The Injustice of Marijuana Arrests, and they use 2 examples who are in prison for marijuana. Well, they're actually both in for 3 strikes laws. And if it hadn't been for 3 strikes laws, the judges never would have sent them to prison for marijuana. So what I like to say is if the New York Times is trying to make a point, and they can't even find one single marijuana user in prison to make their point, there probably aren't any. Also, what irks me about this is I think 3 strikes laws are terrible. And the New York Times is actually, or the editorial page, is more concerned about promoting marijuana than helping the people I consider the real victims of our criminal justice system. So this sign, Stop Arresting Patients, and the one on the left, stoparrestingpatients.org. In 2010, the Medical Marijuana Initiative in Arizona, their campaign was called stoparrestingpatients.org. And so I was debating the guy from the Marijuana Policy Project, who was their campaign manager, and I said, can you name one genuine medical patient in jail or prison just for marijuana? And he said, I'll get back to you on that. And the next day the claim came off their website, but the signs all still said that. So the entire name of their campaign wasn't even true. And this was a cartoon in Politico just a few weeks ago. And it's somebody saying, how'd they get you? He says, oh, I got caught with 3 joints 10 years ago. Well, nobody is in prison just for 3 joints. But here, Politico is a very well-respected news outlet, and here they are running this. And you'll see this all the time. It's just one of these myths. I like to say the pot smoker in prison is kind of the equivalent of the welfare queen. Ronald Reagan used to talk about welfare queens, and there weren't any. There was nobody who was living a life of luxury just on welfare. It's the same thing with the pot smokers in prison. It's a great story. It's a really good story, but it's not found in real life. The problem is, by focusing on this, we are ignoring the real victims of our criminal justice system. And working in prisons, I saw a lot of it. 2/3 of all the people in prison in the United States have a diagnosable substance abuse disorder. Half of all the people in prison are there for a crime they committed while they were drunk or high. If 2/3 of all the people in prison had an infectious disease, everybody who so much as jaywalked would get a course of antibiotics. But we pretty much ignore this disease. And often, I would talk to these people, and they're often people who never hurt anybody clean and sober. And they're in for serious crimes. They're in for violent crimes. Most murders are committed under the influence. They're in for serious property crimes. And I would ask them, have you ever been arrested for anything you did clean and sober? And they would think about it. And I could see them like clicking through each of their arrests, and they'd look at me and go, no. And nobody had ever asked them that. Nobody had ever offered them treatment. And I saw people my age who'd just been in and out of prison. Every time they got out, they'd relapse back to drugs or alcohol. They'd get arrested. They'd end up back in prison. They'd stay clean and sober in prison, and they thought they were cured. And it would happen over and over again. And we should be getting them treatment. If we want to really deal with mass incarceration, we have to focus on the people in for violent property crimes and get them into treatment. And we should be starting as teenagers with their very first crime, so they don't live a whole life going in and out of prison. Instead, what we hear about are the nonviolent drug offenders in prison. And of course, they use this term nonviolent drug offenders, and it sounds like drug users. But remember, they're almost all drug dealers. And a lot of them don't even use the drugs that they sell, so treatment isn't going to make any difference for them. And these are actually the people I had the least sympathy for, because they made this sober decision to sell drugs just because it's easy money. And they know darn well, most of them, of the dealers in prison, 95% were selling hard drugs. Cocaine, meth, heroin. And these are drugs that kill people. They knew that it killed people. These drugs cause most of the violence that fill our prisons. So I actually had a lot more sympathy for the violent criminals. But of course, I'm not running for political office. Nobody running for political office could say, we should care more about the violent criminals. It won't go over well. So anyway, marijuana possession, drug possession are not the cause of mass incarceration. What did cause it? In the 1980s, when Reagan was elected, he didn't do this, but a lot of conservative thought came in, and the idea was the way to deal with crime is to lock people up. And so they brought in 3 strikes laws, they got rid of parole, they had longer sentences, they brought back mandatory minimums, and as a result, incarceration skyrocketed. And I see people, when I worked in the prison, I would see people there for just ridiculously long sentences. But the main thing is, drug laws are not the cause of mass incarceration, and there's virtually nobody in prison just for marijuana possession. Myth number 2, police waste time and money pursuing marijuana users. They should spend it on serious crime. Well, police don't go to rock concerts and bust people who light up. They don't keep lists of suspected marijuana users. They don't patrol college campuses with drug-sniffing dogs. Not that I know of, maybe they do. Basically, they don't go looking for marijuana possession. You can try this experiment. You can call the local police and say, I know somebody who smokes pot every night in their own home, and they will laugh at you. They are just not interested. They're not interested in possession. There is no war on drug users. This was in a columnist from the Los Angeles Times a couple of years ago, and he put it very nicely, so I want to read it. The weed warriors are back, and one old tale they're spinning is pure bunk. It's that too much tax money, cop time, and jail space are wasted corralling and incarcerated marijuana users. Maybe that was true decades ago, but today it's a myth. No one gets busted and jailed for merely smoking a joint. But over 500,000 people get arrested for marijuana possession in this country every year. And so what the heck is going on? How is that happening if police aren't looking for marijuana? And there's an answer to it. And the answer was really clear in data that came out from Vancouver, BC, before they legalized. But this is pretty much the story in the United States. Most U.S. crime is a symptom of substance abuse. We used to do this study that Congress discontinued. The last time it was done in 2013, the Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring Survey, where in several cities they looked at how many people, they just drug tested huge numbers of people who were arrested. And what they found is 75% of all arrestees were positive for illegal drugs, and 49%, I put down 50%, had marijuana. They tested positive, which means half of all arrestees are current marijuana users. I work with drug addicts, a lot of people do, and they carry their drugs everywhere. They never plan on getting caught. They always plan on getting high, and so they are very often carrying drugs when they get arrested. And this is what they found in Vancouver, BC. Almost all the arrests were incidental arrests. They were arrested for something else, and they had drugs on them at the time. That is the vast majority of these marijuana arrests. And you can see this is a graph of pot arrests. Pot arrests have just skyrocketed as marijuana has gone up, but they're not being prosecuted, they're not being incarcerated. So that's what happens. Police find pot and other drugs when they stop and arrest people for other reasons. So they don't go looking for them, the drugs actually come to them. They don't spend time, they don't spend money in pursuit of drug possession. And the irony is they say police should be pursuing more serious crimes. The only time they find drug possession is when they are pursuing more serious crimes. A couple exceptions, and you hear this everywhere. Domestic violence. If police get called, there's a woman with a black eye, and she says, "Oh, I'm clumsy, I fell down." They've got nothing to go on. They know they got to get the guy out of the house or he's going to abuse her as soon as they leave. They will search for drugs. And if they find drugs, they will take him to jail right then. But other than that, it's rarely prosecuted. So these 500,000 arrests are not a drug war gone mad. They're the result of drug abusing criminals who carry drugs with them everywhere. Really, there's not a war on marijuana. However, the pro-legalization groups really want us to believe that our prisons are filled with marijuana users. So you look at the sign. 700,000 marijuana arrests is called mass incarceration. Well, none of those people are being incarcerated. And they know that when they make these signs. But this is how we're misinformed. They want to equate these arrests with incarceration. But like I said, these arrests are rarely prosecuted and really never incarcerated. Myth 3, the drug war is a war on drug users. I grew up in this very liberal home where saying something nice about Richard Nixon could get you disowned, but I'm going to anyway. Nixon ran in '68 on a law and order platform, and he won. And he said to his advisors, "Okay, what do we do about crime?" And they said, "You're going to have to deal with the nation's heroin epidemic." There was a big epidemic at that time. And so Nixon launched his drug war. 2/3 of the drug war money went to treatment. 1/3 went to deal with overseas traffickers. It was the French connection. And Nixon, in his speech on the drug war, said, I can't imitate his voice, but we are going to tighten the noose around the necks of drug peddlers and thereby loosen the noose around the necks of drug users. He was actually the first president to treat addiction as an illness. He eliminated mandatory minimums for drug possession. That's why all these people say, oh, Nixon hated marijuana users. He was actually pretty nice to them, and drug users in general. He hired Jerry Jaffe, who was this liberal Jewish psychiatrist, who's an expert in inner city drug addicts, and he made him the first drug czar. And one of the things they did is they told the military to stop court-martialing people who were drug addicts. Up until then, if somebody went to their CO and said, "Hey, I'm addicted to drugs, I need help," they would jail them. And that stopped under Nixon. The methadone programs we have in this country, there were just a handful of them before, and they spread them all across the country. They think the reason he used the term war on drugs was just he wanted the conservatives of his party not to be upset at him for coddling criminals by giving them treatment, which is really what he was doing. And it was very successful. Overdoses and crime decreased in most of America's large cities during Nixon's drug war. Under Reagan, we got rid of most of the treatment, but there's never a war on drug users, and there really isn't today. Okay, myth number 4, marijuana laws are racist. They target minorities. This was a study by the ACLU about 5 or 6 years ago that found that African Americans are arrested for marijuana possession at 3.7 times the rate of whites. And this is true. Now, it's definitely true, but I say marijuana is only found incidentally, not all, but mostly found incidentally when people are searched for other reasons. So are African Americans arrested and searched 3 times as often as whites? And the answer is yes. African Americans are actually arrested for all crimes at 3 times the rate of whites. It's different for different crimes. Burglary 3 times, murder 6 times as often, robbery 8 times as often. The only crime that African Americans are arrested significantly less than whites is drunk driving. And I don't know why that is. Anyway, there's no call to legalize murder or robbery, obviously. Now, this whole thing is really unjust. The reason, there's multiple reasons for this disparity, but they all come down to centuries of racism. Biologically, there's no such thing as race. There's no biological reason for this to be happening. It's the result of the culture that's been forced on African Americans for years. So this is a far worse injustice than marijuana arrests. But basically, African Americans get arrested for marijuana for the same reason that whites do, which is they get arrested for something else, they're searched, and marijuana is found. Now, also, African Americans get stopped and searched for no reason at all at much higher rates of whites, so marijuana is found more often. And African Americans do have a slightly higher rate, but certainly not 3 times the rate. And this is really typical of pro-marijuana research. And this, 2 things. One, this got covered in every single news outlet in the country. Whereas at the same time, there's a really good study on what marijuana did to college students, and USA Today covered it, but nobody else. But the other thing is, here's what they do. They find a trend, they say that marijuana caused it, and the news media covers it and never questions them. And nobody pointed out this deception. I used to contribute to the ACLU, and I stopped after this. Not very happy about it. Anyway, and the thing is, legal drug industries target African Americans much more than the illegal ones do. So alcohol and tobacco target black neighborhoods with liquor stores and advertising. In Denver, the dispensaries, the grow operations, the marijuana processing are overwhelmingly in minority neighborhoods. And in Colorado, arrests for underage use are down for white kids. They're up 50% for black kids. But here's the biggest one. So this is past year marijuana use in different ethnic groups. The blue is 2001. The red is 2012. In 2001, white and black marijuana use were pretty much the same. But then they brought in the marijuana dispensaries, which caused use to go up. And what we see is white use doubled, black use tripled. So the marijuana industry actually does target, I think, targets African Americans more than drug dealers did. And what irks me about this is the industry is using the plight of blacks just for their own selfish end to legalize marijuana. And the ACLU played along with this. The thing is, the real injustice is that, and it really is, I mean, that we incarcerate African Americans, we arrest them and incarcerate them at far higher rates than whites. And it really is the result of years of racism. Myth number 5. For teenagers, pot is safer than alcohol. When schizophrenia runs in your family, you think about it. Marijuana users risk dropping out of school and being less successful. Alcohol users risk car crashes. Which one do parents want for their kids? Neither one. That's what I say. Each drug is the worst in its own way. Saying one drug is safer than the other is a sales technique. It's like this old Lucky Strike ad. We don't tell people to use cocaine instead of heroin. We tell them to get clean and sober. Legalization will make it harder for teenagers to buy marijuana. This is an ad that they used in Colorado in 2012, and it is really tricky. I mean, read this line: regulate the sale of marijuana and help me keep it out of his hands. And this is actually classical Orwellian doublespeak, using language to deceive, to say the opposite of what's true. I looked up the definition of regulation. It is a rule made by an authority. So the criminal code are regulations. The law making marijuana illegal is a regulation. But they've decided to call that the unregulated criminal market. And they use the word regulation only for regulate, once you've made it legal. So the word regulate sounds tough, but when they use the word regulate, what they're actually saying is we're going to weaken the regulations. And as you know, it passed in Colorado, so this deception worked. The other thing they say is that store clerks card while dealers don't. So it's going to be harder for kids to get pot when we legalize it. Well, that is not what teenagers say. So this comes from Monitoring the Future, and it's the percent of the kids, 10th graders, who say this drug is easy to obtain. Alcohol and tobacco up almost 80%, marijuana about 70%. Marijuana is quasi-legal in this country. So legal drugs or quasi-legal drugs are easy to get. Then you look at prescription pain medicine, requires a doctor's prescription. Those are much harder to get, only about 25%. And the strictly illegal drugs are the hardest to get. Heroin and crystal meth, very few kids said those were easy to get. So legalization will not keep kids away from drugs. Tough drug laws actually do. Myth number 7, marijuana use is an adult choice. So we're only legalizing it for adults. Well, here's Mr. Butts from Doonesbury saying, studies show that almost 90% of all smokers start before they turn 18. Same is true with marijuana. 90% start before 21. Of the ones who become addicted, almost 90% start before age 18. So there's almost all starting in their teenage years. Teenage use is not an adult choice. It's really, and the industries know this. Myth number, I tried to find a photo on the internet of drug dealers, and every single one of them had them wearing hoodies. It's like, there's a dress code. It's required attire for a drug deal. Anyway, I got this picture. So if we legalize marijuana, drug dealers will no longer target our children. What this does not say is who will target our children. And we should know this. This is the tobacco industry. The tobacco companies are really the world's experts at targeting teenagers. They figure out all sorts of tricks. The marijuana industry is actually better at it already. And that's because they offer products directly that kids love. And you got to look at what's being sold in the marijuana stores. So Colorado stores, they're not full of bags of green leafy weed like I bought from people in the 70s. They are full of marijuana edibles made from soda, cookies, and candy. This is a shelf in a Colorado marijuana store. Soda pop infused with marijuana. Pot tarts. Reefer's peanut butter cup. These things attract kids and teenagers. In Colorado, calls to poison control for toddlers ingesting marijuana have skyrocketed. This is why. They're not smoking their parents' pot. Ganja gum, Stonios, gummy bears infused with THC, Ganja Joy. But also vaporizers designed to look like pens that can be used in class. I said this before, but I'll say it again. Why do addictive drug industries target teenagers? So here's Mr. Butts talking to Mr. Brewski, and he says, you can look it up, dude. The top 10% of drinkers consume 50% of all alcohol sold. In other words, fully half our sales are to alcoholics. How's that for a business model? Actually, marijuana and tobacco have that one beat. This is from the Colorado Department of Public Health. Most marijuana users are occasional users, but by occasional, it's once a month or less. They consume 4% of all marijuana. 2 to 3% of the population uses daily. They consume 87% of the marijuana sold in Colorado. So who do you think the industry cares about? And the best way to create these daily addicted users is to get them started as teenagers, because the teen brain is more prone to addiction. People who start in their teen years will use more as adults than people who start as adults. So the pot industry has to target teenagers to survive, just like alcohol and tobacco do. If they didn't target teens, they go broke. So we should not believe that they just want adults to use. Teens will use no matter what. People are going to use drugs. Well, they're going to find a way. Nothing we say will make a difference. Let me just go over this. I'm going to try to go quickly here. This is cocaine use. The top line is the teenage belief that cocaine is harmful. The bottom line is teenage cocaine use. In the 80s, it was considered a safe, trendy drug. But then 1987, actually right about this time of year, Len Bias, first round draft pick for the Boston Celtics, 2 days after he was picked, died of a cocaine overdose. Huge news. Everything changed in the news media. Suddenly, cocaine became dangerous and deadly. That's what everybody knew about it. And you can see the belief amongst teenagers that the drug was dangerous doubled, and their use dropped by 2/3. And the lesson is teenagers are smart. Marijuana use, the top line is past year marijuana use. The bottom line is the belief that it's risky. These are mirror images of each other. Teenagers do not use regardless. They use based on how dangerous they think the drug is. And we can make a huge difference. So the gray line is daily teenage marijuana use. It was 11% back in 1978. It dropped down by 1992. It dropped down to 2%. That's when you're talking about DARE. It was more than just DARE. It was what happened is the parent movements formed in 1978, and they put a lot of pressure on the news and entertainment media to tell the downside of marijuana. So it really came through news and entertainment. DARE actually did not succeed at all. They did tests on DARE, and they found that nobody really paid that much attention to them. But the news and entertainment media, they did. And we decreased daily teenage marijuana use by 80%. So basically, teenagers respond to good information about how harmful drugs are. In Sweden, Norway, teenage use is 1/5 the rate of Canada and the United States. And these are liberal countries, but they have the strictest marijuana laws and strictest drug laws in the world. They spend a lot of money on education. They have no tolerance for drug use. If someone gets arrested, they say, stop using. And they spend a ton of money on treatment. So teenage use is almost entirely preventable. My suggestion is keep our laws strict, but stop telling people how wonderful it is and start talking about the harm it causes. It really does work to do that. Conclusions, teenagers will make good good decisions if they get good info. There is no way to legalize a drug for adults without increasing teenage use. Myth 10, tax windfall. I just want to tell you what the news media is doing with this. All these stories about taxes never tell both sides. Ledgers have two sides. There's cost and benefit. There's income and expense. And I finally found one news story that listed both, and this was from Colorado, and it said, Colorado is going to bring in $134 million in taxes this year, and we're going to spend almost all of it, $130 million, on youth prevention, addiction treatment, anti-stone driving campaigns, regulating marijuana stores. Governor Hickenlooper actually said this. He says, I tell other governors we are not making any extra revenue from pot. And there was a study that was done very recently in Colorado, and they found that for every dollar they bring in taxes, the state spends $4.5 million to mitigate the effect of legalization. And this is really typical. The same study like this was done about alcohol. Alcohol costs government 6 times what they bring in taxes. And the reason is we don't see these costs, but the cost of addiction, of substance abuse, healthcare, criminal justice, and especially lost productivity, that's the hugest one. You think about those teenagers who are earning 15 to 20% less as adults, well, they're also paying less in taxes, and that's going to wipe out any tax benefit. Legalization eliminates cartels in the black market. Basically, the cartels are booming in Colorado, and what they're doing is they've got grow operations and they've got grow houses. In the national forest, they've got grow operations. As far as the black market, it is booming in Colorado. California's illegal weed industry is doing better than ever. And that's because it's a weed. Alcohol is hard to do black market because people want a certain quality from it. But marijuana, people just want to get high. And anybody can grow this. So anytime you tax a product, there's going to be a black market. So after they promised California they'd have all these marijuana taxes, California now proposes slashing pot taxes to help the regulated marijuana industry compete with the black market. So much for tax revenue. Last myth, and I just like mentioning it, this is my favorite. Prohibition of alcohol failed. We should learn from that. Actually, during Prohibition, at the beginning, alcohol use dropped by 2/3. By the end, it was still down by 1/3. Cirrhosis dropped by 2/3. Disorderly conduct in half. Homicides were going up before Prohibition, went up afterwards, stayed flat during Prohibition. I think the problem with Prohibition is that the people who brought it to us, it was basically brought to us by conservatives who have this view that people obey the law just because it's the law. And that really is how conservatives think. The rest of us obey the law because we think it's a good idea or we're afraid of getting caught. And they never made any attempt to educate the public that there were benefits to Prohibition. Had they done that, had they really tried to show people, look, there's less crime, there's less child abuse, there's less domestic violence, marriages are being saved, maybe it would have succeeded. I don't know. Anyway, we're surrounded by myth. We're surrounded by a lot of misinformation, which is why people believe the myths. So just want to look at this. Here's Zonker Harris saying, this war on marijuana users is social policy at its most irrational. Now listen to this sentence. Why are we at war with a non-addictive drug that kills nobody? In one sentence, he makes 3 false statements. There is no war on users. It is addictive. And with traffic fatalities, we know that it actually kills thousands every year. I'll get to that. Anyway, that's enough on this. We need to take a break. But let's do some questions.
I work in prevention and do a lot of work with youth in schools, and one of the myths that you didn't address but that we hear every single time from kids is that it's a plant, it's all natural. And there have been a lot of studies recently that have addressed all the chemicals that are sprayed on it outside of that that's sold like in a dispensary in Iowa, but the black market, so to speak. All the things that are sprayed on it, and plus now we're also seeing adulteration even with fentanyl. So could you kind of address that myth a little bit?
Well, the myth is it's a plant. My patients, you always have to say that one in the right voice. But my patients tell me this. It's a plant. It's natural. It's a herb. God created it. And I remind them there's lots of things that are very toxic that are natural. It's still a problem. It's still not good for you. Arsenic occurs naturally. But the marijuana is extremely toxic these days. It's because a lot of it is, especially, I talked about the stuff that's being grown by the cartels, and they're shipping it to other states and selling it. And they use huge amounts of toxic things that are completely illegal. When the police go into these grows that they find in the national forest, they often have to have to have hazmat suits to deal with the stuff that's there. So the marijuana being bought, people have no idea what's in it. Any other questions? Okay, let's take a 15-minute break. Start again maybe at 10:10. Okay, this is going to be a talk about medical marijuana laws, and I really want to make it clear I'm talking about the laws just as much as about marijuana. And this is one of the things the pot lobby really tries to confuse, is they want to confuse medical marijuana use with medical marijuana laws. And they want to argue, well, all they want to argue about is whether marijuana has medical use. And the fact is, it does have medical use. By the way, so do cocaine, opium, and meth. Crystal meth is actually a prescription drug. I've never prescribed it, but it's there. The question is not whether marijuana is medical use, but whether medical marijuana laws are a good way to provide the benefit of cannabinoids. They also want to confuse CBD with marijuana. And so when I talk about marijuana and medical marijuana laws, I am referring to THC. CBD is the non-addictive component, and I'll mention that a little bit. Okay, so the criteria for approving a medicine in this country or medical delivery system is it has to have some medical benefit, it has to have no serious side effects, and if it does have side effects, then it better be significantly superior to anything else that you could use. And medical marijuana laws, and marijuana for that matter, really only meet criteria 1. And we don't approve medicines just because they're helpful for some people. Those are the 2 criteria are in there. So let me just briefly go over, there's things that marijuana is definitely good for, and there's good research behind it. So pain is probably number 1 these days. And the most studied is neuropathic pain, but that doesn't mean it's better for neuropathic pain than any other type of pain. It seems to be good for all types of pain. The other one is spasticity of multiple sclerosis. That's been really studied, well studied. And the nausea and vomiting of chemotherapy. And that's one of the earliest studies. They're actually prescription cannabinoids, Marinol, is approved for treating that. There's some smaller studies that I thought were pretty good. Appetite loss and wasting, both in cancer and HIV patients, and Crohn's disease. It seems to work. I didn't see anything ulcerative colitis, but it should be similar. Anyway, these are things that marijuana has definitely been shown to help with. But a couple caveats on this. One is, almost all these studies compared the cannabinoids to placebo, not to other medicine. And actually, for all of these things, all these medical conditions, there are non-addictive medicines that work as well. Marijuana is not the first choice for any condition. The third caveat is that most of the research was not done with marijuana. It was done with prescription cannabinoids. It was done with Marinol, which is synthetic THC. It was done with Seasomet, which is another synthetic THC. And both those are approved for use in this country. They're really expensive, which is the drug company's way of doing things. Sativex, which is not yet approved in this country, a combination of THC and CBD in other countries, is approved to treat the spasticity of multiple sclerosis. And a Epidiolex or Epidiolex, I don't know how it's pronounced, pure cannabidiol, pure CBD, approved for the use in childhood seizures. I think, the news reports keep saying marijuana has been shown to help. Actually, most of the studies were done with the prescription cannabinoids. And I'm going to say, I think we should be using these prescription medicines and not have medical marijuana laws. And I'm going to explain why here. And by the way, some of the studies, this is a huge study that came out recently. 1,500 pain patients on opioid pain medicine. Many of them also use marijuana. And what they found is that the marijuana users actually had more problems with pain and less ability to manage the pain. And they didn't find any evidence that marijuana reduced opioid use or opioid discontinuation. Now this is like I said, long study, but it's the whole question, yes, it works for pain, but does it really, in real life, does it actually make a difference in people's experience of pain? And that hasn't been shown so well. Whereas the opioid pain medicines, which I don't like at all, chronic use of opioids are a terrible idea. But they clearly make a difference in how people function. Okay, there's one study that actually compared the prescription cannabinoid Marinol to marijuana. And what they found is both of them worked equally well for the pain. I think the pain was they had to put their hand in ice water and see how long they could tolerate it. They could tolerate it much longer when they were on Marinol or marijuana. But the Marinol worked twice as long as the marijuana, and people said they didn't get as high from the Marinol. So if you're a genuine pain patient, Marinol is actually preferable because you probably don't want the high and you don't want to be having to dose every 3 or 4 hours. If you're a pothead, you like dosing every 3 or 4 hours. And that's, they use that term. I know people who are, I've got a patient who actually works at a medical marijuana farm, and he says they always, oh yeah, a lot of our workers medicate. Anyway, so again, there's really no reason to be using marijuana. The prescription cannabinoids work as well. Now, the things that there's some evidence for, but it's preliminary, Tourette's, HIV, hepatitis, Alzheimer's, it's good evidence, but it's just not a whole lot. Insomnia, I mean, it works for insomnia. I just hear this from people all the time. I don't like it. I don't like addictive drugs for insomnia. I'm always trying to get people off them. But anyway, I think there's evidence. It's not as good research evidence, but I think there's evidence that it helps with all these. With Alzheimer's, it works for the behavioral problems associated with it. But there's also other medicines that do that as well. Propranolol works really well for almost any patient who's got impulsive violence. Okay, things that there's no evidence for or it actually makes the illness worse: glaucoma, epilepsy. Now this is THC, not CBD. Alcohol and other drug abuse, and any of the psychiatric illnesses. And I'm going to talk a little bit about PTSD. Glaucoma is the one that they sold marijuana for in the beginning. There's a lot of states that have passed a law. It's enshrined in state law that marijuana is good treatment for glaucoma. It's not. It decreases intraocular pressure. That's why they thought it'd be good, but it only works for 3 or 4 hours, and then there's a rebound. And it also decreases intraocular blood flow, which makes symptoms worse. So it's not recommended. The Glaucoma Foundation recommends against it. But like I said, it's now law in several states, which is why we really should not be approving laws by popular vote, approving medications by popular vote. PTSD, there's a lot of, the studies are all over the place. There's studies that show that it's absolutely wonderful, and then there's studies that show no benefit at all. There's reviews of the studies that show that it's wonderful, and reviews that show it doesn't do anything. So politics is everywhere. The best review I found looked at 6 studies. 3 of them used Marinol, 3 of them used actual marijuana. Only one had a control group. All of them depended on self-report. And self-report is not very good when you're giving an addictive drug to a disease where there's a high percentage of people who are addicted. In PTSD, in some of the studies of PTSD, half of all the patients have a substance use problem. But anyway, they found there's some evidence for control of nightmares, insomnia, flashbacks, and night sweats. So it is helpful for some people. There's non-addictive medicines that work for all of those except for flashbacks. There's great medicines for the nightmares. And I just, don't like people's substance use problems being put on an addictive drug. I think it's, this inhibits, it causes more problems in the long run. One study that I found that I kind of liked because it didn't just rely on self-report. It looked at their drug use, their violent behavior, their employment, looked at over 2,000 veterans, and it looked at the ones who smoked pot for years and years, the ones who never smoked pot, the ones who started smoking pot during treatment, and the ones who stopped smoking pot during treatment. And what it found is that the ones who never used or quit during treatment had the fewest PTSD symptoms. The long-term users, the ones who started during treatment, had the most symptoms, and they also had more drug and alcohol abuse, which is not too surprising. People use one drug are likely to want to use another, but they also found more violence in the ones who used marijuana, especially the ones who started during treatment. No difference in unemployment. So patients with PTSD often like addictive drugs. I really try to keep them away from it. But and I quote this study a lot. I just say, there's research showing it can make your PTSD symptoms worse. It's better to use non-addictive medicines. That's how it applies in my practice. I have a very firm belief that I've developed over the years that people are always happier off addictive drugs, especially people who have a substance abuse problem. They're always happier clean and sober. I do not think letting an addict continue to use is a favor. I have seen patients who quit marijuana and get totally clean and sober, and usually they're happier, and the symptoms they said marijuana was treating often get better. In fact, if it's a psychiatric symptom, it always seems to get better. So I try to get all my patients off addictive drugs. That includes the benzos, that includes opiate pain medicines. Exception is ADHD. I have just not found anything else that works for ADHD besides some of the stimulants. I do a lot of alternative medicine to treat anxiety. Anyway, using addictive drug daily is especially problematic. People who take Ambien every night, I say, there's evidence that it's more prone to dementia. There was one study that showed people actually died younger. Chronic opioids do not work for chronic pain, except for very severe nerve pain. In my life, I've never started anyone on Xanax or Ambien. I think that's still true. And if they're using an addictive drug for sleep, I tell them you're never going to get better. You got to get on something non-addictive. Marijuana works for pain and it works for insomnia, but they're better off with a non-addictive medicine. This is what I tell my patients, and it makes psychiatric conditions worse. I really try to get all of my patients off marijuana, and I spend a lot of time talking to people about it. And it's kind of nice because I'm not the authority. They're getting it from somebody else. I'm just telling them. So I get to be the informant. I'm the repository of good information, and I try to be kind of neutral that way, even though I'm not. Well, for them I am. It really is their decision. Okay, criteria for approving a drug. As I said, has medical benefit? Yes, pot has medical benefit. Serious side effects? We'll look at that in a second. If there's side effects, then it's superior to the alternatives? No. The prescription cannabinoids like Marinol work as well or as better. So the question is, if other medicines work just as well, why do we even have medical marijuana laws? And the reason is, this was invented by NORML. It's a pro-legalization group. They were not interested in medicine. In fact, in '79, their founder actually admitted that he got quoted in some news article, and he denies it now, but he was quoted saying, we're going to use it as a red herring to give marijuana a good name. The idea did not come from physicians, healthcare providers, or advocacy groups. All of the ballot measures for medical marijuana were paid for largely by 3 billionaires. George Soros, who ideologically believes in legalization of all drugs, and then John Sperling, I forget his name. I forget the first name. Somebody Sperling from the University of Phoenix, and Peter Lewis from Progressive Insurance, who are both marijuana users. And that's why we have these laws. If it weren't for those 3 people, we wouldn't have anything. So side effects of marijuana itself, and this is from the National Academy of Medicine. Somebody asked earlier today about bipolar disorder, and their conclusion is there's a strong or moderate evidence that marijuana causes these things: motor vehicle accidents, overdoses by children, impaired learning, schizophrenia. It worsens bipolar disorder, doesn't cause it. Causes depression, causes suicide, causes social anxiety, causes or increases abuse of other drugs. And so if medical marijuana laws increase use, it's going to increase all of these problems. And I look at that as a side effect of the drug. If it increases use, that's a side effect. So what are the side effects of medical marijuana laws? I think the biggest one is diversion to substance abuse, and that it increases both adult and teenage use. And I'll say lastly, it's a drain on state budget. So all these other things are, if it increases adult use, it's going to increase all the problems that marijuana causes. So diversion, let me look at that first. And how do they do this? There's kind of 3 steps to it. And the first step is pot doctors. Patients don't go to their primary care doctor. When the law got passed in Arizona, I got all these calls from my patients for about 2 months, and then nobody called me again, because a handful of doctors set up practices where they do marijuana evaluations, and they give everybody a yes. And there's a study that was done in California that looked at 1,600 patients who applied for a marijuana card. Only 2% were turned down, and they were turned down because they wouldn't even pretend to have an illness. Here's an ad from a California medical marijuana consultant. If you don't qualify, your consultation is free. So you can see there's obviously motivation to approve everybody. I knew one person who said that the secretary actually typed up the marijuana card before he even saw the doctor. And what happens in states is a handful of doctors write almost all the recommendations. So in Montana, at one point, 10 doctors had written 90% of the recommendation. 1 doctor had written 40%. He did a thriving business. In Arizona, 24 doctors at one point had written 3/4 of all the certifications, and naturopaths wrote 2/3. Arizona is a big naturopathic medical school, but it's not covered by insurance, and they really don't make good money, and they spend a lot. So I've talked to some of them, and they know it's a scam, but they need the money. And that's who really does it. Doctors who can't earn money any other way. And so pot docs basically give a recommendation to anyone who pays their fee. It's, you go to a doctor, regular doctor, and say, I want Xanax. They'll do an evaluation and decide if you really need it. It's different. So step 2 of diversion is the pain loophole. Most of the patients claim pain. The most common things people get medical marijuana for are pain, anxiety and depression that it does not work for, and insomnia, which I wish they wouldn't use it for, but it works very well. So there's a study done in 2014, looked at 7 states, got their data. 91% of the patients got the pot for pain, only 3% for cancer, 2% for all the other serious illnesses. A study published in Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research, is a very pro-marijuana journal, found that 61% had pain, 58% anxiety, 50% depression, only 3% cancer though. So remember, they advertise these medical marijuana laws. You don't remember. I remember in Arizona that all their ads were about cancer. No, it's not really for cancer. So in Arizona, 93% pain, 2% of the patients get the pot for cancer. In Colorado, again, 93% get the marijuana for pain, 5% for cancer. Now in Rhode Island, it was only 61% pain and 6% cancer. But it's still primarily pain. So the problem with pain is it's easy to fake, it's hard to disprove, there's no objective test. In Iowa's law, Iowa has a CBD law, but it allows untreatable pain, and 52% of the CBD patients do claim pain. So it's still similar. The question is, are they genuine pain patients or are they substance abusers? So step 3 is, who are the patients? And the journal Harm Reduction, which is a very pro-drug journal, published this study about 4,000 medical marijuana applicants, and it found that the average patient was a 32-year-old male, and 88% of them had been using marijuana since age 19. In Montana, at one point, 10% of everybody on probation and parole had a medical marijuana card. So there is evidence that medical marijuana patients are almost entirely substance abusers, but it's not perfectly clear. I work in a community mental health center. I do substance abuse work and I do general mental health. None of my general mental health patients have a marijuana card. My substance abuse patients, huge numbers do. So 90% claim pain. They often believe it themselves. I mean, these patients, I don't think some of them are just lying, but I think most of them really believe that it works for their pain. So the question is, okay, but what is really unconsciously, what's really getting them to do it? Is it the pain or the substance abuse? Which disease is talking? And so I've submitted this study, and I never heard back from the journal. I haven't heard back yet. So pain patients are mostly female. I found one study that 55% female, whereas substance abusers are 2/3 male and 1/3 female, and that includes marijuana abusers. I had a patient who did this. She was looking for a pain doctor, and she walked into the waiting room, and it was all young guys. And she said, this isn't a pain doctor. This is somebody who's misusing his license to make money by handing out opiates. I don't want to see him. And she turned around and left. She found another pain doctor. She walked in, and it was mostly older women. She says, this is a real pain doctor's office. So we know that. Same is true with medical marijuana programs. So I contacted all the medical marijuana programs at one point, and I asked them, what % of your pain patients are male? And I got results from 7 of them. And so on this graph, you can see it pretty well. So the green is less than 50% male, and that's where you would see if everybody were genuine pain patients. It would be mostly female. And then the blue is the area around 2/3 male, and that's what we would see if everybody were substance abusers. And they were really, they thought it was pain, but they were really motivated by their substance abuse. As you can see, all 7 states that contacted me are pretty much in the substance abuse range. The lowest is Oregon at 61%, but it's still close to that. So what this says is these patients are saying they're getting the marijuana for pain, but their demographics say substance abuse, not pain. If the demographics for pain would be less than 50% male. So I'm highly suspicious. And they think they're using it for pain. I think they're pretty convinced. So what I found with my own patients with marijuana cards is there's a tiny number with no history of substance abuse. Seriously, a few per year. All the rest have a past history of substance abuse. And for the ones with psychiatric complaints, the problems get better when they stop using marijuana. So there's 3 types. There's the ones who are just plain lying. And I saw a lot of people like this when I worked in a substance abuse program, and they'd come in and say, oh yeah, I had a marijuana card. A friend of mine told me what doctor to see and what to say, and I did it. Nowadays, mostly I see people who are substance abusers who really believe that they are treating pain, anxiety, and insomnia. And I'm suspecting that a lot of this is denial. And then every now and then I see a genuine medical patient. So why do I suspect this? What's going on here? And the reason is because we've seen it with alcohol and cigarettes. I saw all these alcoholics when I was younger, and they would always say, oh, I drink because I'm depressed. Well, actually, the depression got better when they quit drinking. Cigarette smokers often say, oh, it helps me relax. But the research shows that smokers are more relaxed when they completely get off cigarettes. And the marijuana users, weed calms me down. And it's really not anxiety. They're really talking about anger and irritability. And it actually gets better when they quit using marijuana. So why do they think that it helps? And there's a lot of reasons. One is they could be medicating withdrawal symptoms. Irritability is a symptom of marijuana withdrawal. They could be medicating feelings, which is exactly what drug addicts do. I heard one person who said, her quote that she liked to use at AA meetings is, I thought feelings were the disease and alcohol was the cure. And then also a brief burst of a good mood or relaxation or calm. And I remember this. So I like to say that I quit smoking pot at age 19, but actually I kept trying it every few months for several years. And each time I would try it, it was great for 10 minutes and then it would be awful again. I'd remember why I quit. And people do that with that drink. It's like for 10 minutes, it's really good. With the cigarette, they feel really good for a minute or two. And then also the addictive pathways. People with an addiction, their mind is always telling them that this is the answer and they believe it. And then there's euphoric recall. I've never found this study, but I remember hearing about it. And so I'm going to quote it because I think it does work. Where they looked at alcoholics and they gave them a depression test when they were drunk and they said they were terribly depressed. And then they gave it to them when they were sober and they said they were feeling okay. And they said, okay, now rate how you felt when they were drunk. And they said, oh, I felt wonderful. And they call that euphoric recall. And I think that's part of what goes into this. And also addicts will make up symptoms. I had a patient who was 6 months sober. This was back in the 80s. She found a bottle of Tuinol, which is an old barbiturate, in her house that she didn't know she'd hidden away. And she set it on the dresser and went to bed, and she could not sleep that night. And her mind kept saying, take a Tuinol, you'll fall asleep. And so she got up and got the bottle of Tuinol and poured it into the toilet and flushed it. And she said as soon as it went down the toilet, her mind calmed down and she could go right to sleep. Addicts' minds will make up symptoms. There's just no other way to put it. And I think this is why medical marijuana patients are largely substance abusers and why they often get better when they quit using. And you got to be suspicious when an addictive drug only seems to work or primarily seems to work with people who have a history of substance abuse and they demand it. Something's probably going on besides just plain old medical use. So I'm suspicious of even the patients who tell me, oh, it definitely works for pain. It's like, why is it that only my substance abusing patients tell me that? The other thing is, a lot of them admit that they use it recreationally. They say they use it both. And I found 3 studies on this. One, 55% of medical marijuana users acknowledge that they use it recreationally. And 2 studies with 75%. And no other prescription drug is abused like this. I mean, Xanax is highly abused. I think most of the patients do, but probably not 3/4. It might be. And this is the Arizona Medical Marijuana Program posted this graph, and it shows when marijuana sales occur, and they peak on Friday. And then the next highest day is Saturday, and then Sunday, and then it goes way, way, way down. They sell twice as much pot on Fridays as on Mondays. So, how medical marijuana laws cause diversion, substance abusers who make up or exaggerate a story about pain or have convinced themselves that their pain responds best to marijuana, and a pot doctor who only makes money if he says yes. And it's really a pretend physician-patient relationship. And my patients admit this, they acknowledge it. But it effectively legalizes the drug for any adult who wants it. And that's what's going on in most medical marijuana states, especially with all these laws. So my belief is that what we should be doing instead, the marijuana helps, cannabinoids help. We should be doing with the FDA-approved medicines, the Marinol, the Cesamet, the Epidiolex. The research has been done on those, and they do everything that marijuana does, and there's much less diversion because they're prescribed by doctors in legitimate practice. The high is less desirable, and there's no industry targeting teenagers. We hope. I mean, I don't trust the drug industry any more than I trust the tobacco industry. So I want to mention Iowa CBD law, which really, unfortunately, is kind of a medical marijuana law because the Iowa law allows up to 3% THC in the cannabidiol. And this is a graph. You can't see the years, but back in 1970, when I was a teenager, the marijuana was a 1 or 2% THC. So in Iowa, CBD can be 3% THC. You can get high off that. It's kind of like Iowa used to have 3-2 beer. Do you still have it? They get rid of that. You still have it? Okay. Anyway, you can still get drunk on 3-2 beer. Back in the 1970s, it was very low potency weed. But the Iowa CBD law is more tightly controlled. It can only be 3%, whereas people who use marijuana love the stuff that's really high potency, 15, 20% higher than that. Also in Iowa, it's only available, I believe, in capsules, tinctures, and creams, which is not good for getting a quick high. And the other thing is, since the smokable plant is not available, drug dealers can't use it as an excuse. In medical marijuana states, drug dealers all get marijuana cards, and if they're caught with pot, they say, oh, it's my medical pot. And it's really hard to prove that's not true. In Iowa, no such problem. The problem is there's a bunch of states that have CBD laws. Almost all of them insist that it's got to be less than 1% THC. Iowa is one of the highest at 3%, Georgia even higher at 5%. Iowa really should decrease its THC content. The industry wants them to increase it, of course. Anyway, so side effects of medical marijuana law. So I went over diversion. That's a big problem. The second side effect is increased use by adults and teenagers. Like I said, if there's increased use, then all the other problems increase as well. So here's a graph, and this shows daily marijuana use, everybody 12 years and older in the United States. And it really started to go up in 2006. And the top one is daily use over the past month, and the bottom one is daily use over the past year. And it's gone up steadily. This is to 2013. But I've looked at it through 2017. We now have data, and it has doubled from 2006 to 2017. And the question is, okay, is it going up equally everywhere, or is it going up mostly in the states with medical marijuana laws? And there's a really good study came out in 2017, and it showed, no, it's going up mostly faster in the medical marijuana law states. And the thing is, what they say is, oh, those medical marijuana states have high rates of use, but they always did. That's why they passed medical marijuana laws. Well, no, the research shows that the high rates came after they passed it. So here's the study. It's not a great graph, but back in the 90s, the upper line is the medical marijuana states, the red line is the non-medical marijuana states. They were the same back in the 90s, but marijuana abuse increased 68% faster in the states with medical marijuana laws. There's not much else that could have caused it besides those laws. Here's just marijuana use in general, increased 66% faster. So this is considered pretty good evidence that medical marijuana laws increase overall marijuana use and abuse. The question is, do they also increase teenage use? And that's harder to show. This is medical marijuana states are in red. The non-medical marijuana states are in blue. This is teenage use. Obviously, the medical marijuana states all have higher teenage use than the non-medical marijuana states. But the claim is, oh yeah, but that predated the use. Well, did medical marijuana cause this difference, or did it predate the laws? And there's some evidence. Teens in medical marijuana states have been shown to be more likely to try marijuana. Teens who see medical marijuana ads are twice as likely to try it. This is probably the best one. In Oregon, the study showed that counties with more medical patients also have higher rates of teenage use, which speaks to diversion. And I think that's pretty clear evidence that the laws themselves are causing increased teenage use. But when you look at this, the research so far says that they do not find medical marijuana laws associated with increased use. And I want to point out, does not find is a negative finding. It doesn't mean it's not true, because you can't prove a negative. Negative findings mean we look and didn't find it. For example, I can't find my keys. I searched my entire house and I didn't find them. That doesn't prove they are not in the house. All it proves is that I didn't look in the right place. Either it proves that either I didn't look in the place, or they're not in the right place, or they're not in the house. One of those two. And I can search the house 100 times and not find them, and I still have those same two choices. Either I didn't look in the right place, or they're not in the house. If 101st time I search the house and I find them, what I know is those 100 studies, I didn't look in the right place. And so that one positive finding overrules all the negative. And the same is true with research. Nobody would say, oh, 100 studies, you didn't find the keys, and one time you did, therefore the preponderance of evidence says they were not in the house. That would not make any sense. So the same really does apply to research. But the thing is, remember, negative findings don't prove anything, because I'm going to talk about the shoddy research. So there's a lot of deceptive research out here. And it's important to learn about because you're going to be running into it all the time. And there's a few tricks we see repeatedly. Research that has no control group. Research that just assumes that correlation is causation. Poorly designed studies that bring you a negative finding. If you do a really lousy search for the keys and don't find them, and then claim, oh, they're not in the house, then it's like the Russians saying, oh, we looked to see if there was any criminal involvement in the murder of journalists, and say, we didn't find any. Well, of course they didn't find any. That's the way they look. Anyway, you can do a really crummy study and then misinterpret negative findings, and that's what happened in this case. So this is a study called Medical Marijuana Laws and Teenage Marijuana Use. The study found no evidence that medical marijuana laws are associated with increased teenage use. They were very good. They didn't say we proved that it didn't. They just said we didn't find it. But man, they went out of their way not to find it. Look what they did. So they only looked at teenage use for 3 years after each state passed its law. So here on the left is Montana. After 3 years, there were 500 medical marijuana patients in Montana. A few years later, there were 30,000, but the study didn't look then. In Colorado, after 3 years, there were about 1,000 medical marijuana patients. A few years later, there were 125,000, but they only looked the first 3 years. And if we look at Colorado, they looked up to 2004. Well, starting in 2006, the blue line is teenage use in Colorado. The red line is the nation. Teenage use went way up in Colorado. It increased 50%. So if they'd looked for all those years, they would have found it. But they didn't look, so they can safely say they didn't find it. But they correctly said we didn't find it. However, the purpose of deceptive research is not to misinform other researchers, it's to get it out in the news media. And they did a wonderful job of getting it in the news media. And there's got to be some cooperation because every single outlet misinterpreted the study. They all misinterpreted it as saying it's proof that this doesn't happen. Medical marijuana won't boost teen pot use. That's not what it's proved. That's like saying keys not in the house, study finds. It's not what happened. But there's CBS, there's US News saying that it's not happening. There's ABC News saying it doesn't lead to increased use. Huffington Post, of course, does not increase teen use. The New York Times, medical use of marijuana doesn't increase use. This is a really crummy study, and actually it's done by people who've been quoted in the press saying very pro-marijuana things. NBC saying the same thing. So what's going on here? These are major media outlets. They have good science journalists. They know what a negative finding is. They all printed the same untrue headline. So I think there's something going on there. But part of the problem is they allow marijuana users to report on this issue. And a lot of marijuana issues, their first allegiance is to marijuana. It's not to journalism. And I'm just showing you so you understand why we are so misinformed about marijuana. And the news media really cooperates with this. So how do you tell if medical marijuana laws are increasing teenage use? And the type of period I'd like to look at is 2005 to 2011 when teenage use went up a whole lot. So did the increase come equally from all states or more from medical marijuana states? And I presented this at a California Society of Addiction Medicine conference as a poster. And the blue line is the non-medical marijuana states, and the red line is the medical marijuana states. And it clearly went up more. Teenage use went up much more in the medical marijuana states. It increased by 33% in those states, but only 6% in the rest of the nation. Now, this is a really tricky graph because it's a wide confidence interval. It should be very fuzzy lines. I started it at 6%. If I want to do a really even-handed graph, it would actually look like this. Those are the same graphs, that and that. This is much more honest. But even so, that difference towards in 2010, 2011, that's a significant difference. So in 2005, 10 states had medical marijuana laws. They only had 20% of the population, but they accounted for 60% of the increased teenage use. I think that's pretty significant evidence that medical marijuana laws increase teenage use. So what are the side effects of medical marijuana laws? Increased adult and teenage use. And I think that is a huge problem because we know that marijuana causes all sorts of problems. And I want to go over these. And I want to go over this. I'm going to look at some more deceptive research. So as a study came out, cannabis does not increase suicidal behavior in psychiatric patients. Once again, you can't prove a negative, so the headline is wrong. But their finding, actually, they said, our findings indicate there is no association. You can't find there is no association. All you can say is we didn't find that there is an association. Just like you can't prove that there are no keys in the house. All you can say is you didn't find them. So the study looked and didn't find the association, but again, look at how they looked. So they asked people, did you use marijuana more than once over the past year? So they got people who use twice, 3 times, 4 times. What we know is that most marijuana users use rarely or occasionally. A small percentage use very large amounts. So they really diluted the data, because the other thing we know is all the studies on suicide show that it occurred in the people who use regularly and heavily. If you did a study of everybody who ever had 1 cigarette in their life, you would find no association between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer. But if you focus only on people who are heavy smokers, there's a huge correlation. And that's what they did. I consider this a very misleading study. Also, the study did find, they actually said, oh, by the way, there is a link between frequency of use and suicide attempts. So they did find that marijuana is associated with suicide attempts. And what all the other studies found, people who used it heavily. Okay, same thing is happening with traffic fatalities. Traffic fatalities related to marijuana, stoned drivers testing positive for THC, have tripled between 1999 and 2010, mainly where they loosened the marijuana laws. Now just look at this. So here's Maryland. Maryland decriminalized, which is a loosening of marijuana laws. And the year after they decriminalized marijuana, crashes, not fatal ones, but all crashes involving marijuana increased by 80%. Colorado and Washington both legalized marijuana. And the top thing here is a headline from the Denver Post. Traffic fatalities linked to marijuana are up sharply in Colorado. Is legalization to blame? The Denver Post gets a lot of advertising money from the marijuana industry, so they are never going to say legalization is to blame. They're going to put it as a question. But the fact is, traffic fatalities in Washington, traffic fatalities involving marijuana, the active metabolite of THC, doubled in Washington the year after legalization. In Colorado, it took 3 years, but they tripled. So clearly, marijuana, loosening marijuana laws is linked to traffic fatalities. And the thing is, what's happening now, it used to be that traffic fatalities were going up, but it was still, alcohol was the 800-pound gorilla. 10 to 1, the traffic fatalities involved alcohol as opposed to marijuana. In this most recent study, alcohol, 187 fatalities in Colorado, marijuana, 99. It's only 2 to 1. So marijuana is gaining, and it's really possible that marijuana could become the deadliest drug behind the wheel. I think we'll see it eventually become the deadliest drug. Yes?
One thing that's always disturbing with these statistics is this. Do we have an estimate of how many people are driving under the influence of either one? Because it might be that given the number of people that are driving with alcohol, that it's a lot less dangerous than marijuana, or it could be the reverse.
Right.
And so without that estimate of how many people are actually driving under the influence of each, we don't really know how to interpret part of it.
Right. He's asking, how do you know what this doesn't, this still tells you, it tells you a fair amount, but it doesn't tell you exactly how serious each drug is. Is marijuana worse behind the wheel, or is alcohol worse behind the wheel? And we don't know, because we don't know how many are driving drunk or driving stoned. But we do know the end result. Okay, and yet, this is other research, half of all marijuana users believe it's safe to drive while high. 2/3 of teenage marijuana users believe that it's safe to drive while high. And a third of them believe that they drive better while high. And this is important because a lot of people are driving high. In Michigan, 51% of medical marijuana patients admitted to driving while high. There's a lot. The thing is, marijuana denial is just kind of amazing. I mean, most alcoholics know that drunk driving is not a good thing. Whereas marijuana users seem to say, no, it doesn't affect me. I'm fine. I can drive. It doesn't affect me. And marijuana denial is a bit different. So there's more of a tendency for them to drive while high. There's so many studies on marijuana and driving that you can pick one to prove almost anything. So the best thing is a good meta-analysis. And probably the best one was done. They looked at a lot of studies. They only looked at marijuana. They didn't want to look at anybody where alcohol or other drugs were involved. And some studies showed no increased risk. One study showed an 8-fold risk, but they averaged it together and found driving while stoned doubles the odds of a serious or fatal accident. And here's a particularly good study from Colorado. They did very good controls. There's years.
I have a question. So, like, marijuana stays in your system for quite longer than alcohol.
Right.
So, what are the like THC levels at the point of the accident?
Well, the question is, yeah, marijuana stays in the system, but there's an active metabolite of marijuana that goes pretty quickly, and that's what they have to look for. So in Washington, they published the data for all the different metabolites, and for most of the metabolites, there was no change in the fatal accidents before and after legalization. But for the most active one, that's the one that it doubled for, and that's what they have to look at. Yeah, they have to test for that.
Have there been any overdose deaths associated with marijuana?
They say that there are, but there's hardly the overdose question. Pretty much the overdose question is brought up. It's a marijuana industry talking point. They like to say there's no deaths by overdose. Tobacco, there's pretty much no deaths by overdose. Alcohol, rarely overdose. People do die from it, but not very often. Tobacco kills almost everybody with lung cancer and heart disease and stroke. So the question about overdose deaths is, and I watch for it because if researchers say that, I go, they're using a marijuana industry talking point. And the pot lobby used to say nobody ever died from overdose. Then we introduced the traffic fatality stuff, and they changed it. They used to say nobody ever died from marijuana. Marijuana had never killed anyone. And then they found out, okay, it kills people behind the wheel. So they changed it. Marijuana never killed anyone by overdose. But anyway, as far as I've heard some reports of it, I don't know that it actually has.
So we know that the metabolites stay in the system for about 30 days. How long does the active metabolite stay in?
Well, I'm going to come to a study on that because that's a real question. Let me just look at this one. So Colorado allowed dispensaries in 2009. Use went from 5,000 medical marijuana patients to 125,000. And these guys did a good control. They looked at traffic fatalities just over those 2 years. So alcohol-related fatalities in Colorado stayed flat during those 2 years. Marijuana-related fatalities in the non-medical marijuana states stayed flat during those 2 years. Marijuana-related fatalities in Colorado doubled during those 2 years. So good controls, good comparison. I want to mention some more deceptive research because it's a real problem. This is the same people, Reese and Anderson. So they did a study and they found that traffic fatalities fall by nearly 9% after the legalization of medical marijuana. And they claim it's because marijuana replaces alcohol. And here's Reuters publishing their study and saying the same thing. After states legalized medical marijuana, traffic deaths fell. What they don't tell you is in states that didn't have medical marijuana, traffic fatalities also fell. And what they did here is there's just no control. Traffic fatalities have been falling since the 1960s, especially since the 80s with Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Falling just as much. Here's Tennessee, here's Colorado, falling equally in medical marijuana and non-medical marijuana states. So what they've done is, they found a trend and they've claimed that it's caused by, they claim that marijuana plays a role in it when it plays no role at all. And it gets disseminated by the news, which is the purpose of these studies. What's happening recently is it's not just marijuana-involved fatalities are increasing. Now they're finding car crashes in general are increasing. So in the 4 states that legalized pot, this is from the Insurance Journal, Nevada, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, they found an increase in the number of car accidents. And that's unusual because it's been pretty steadily going down since the 1960s and probably has to do with marijuana. What it would mean is that the marijuana-related accidents are increasing faster than the alcohol ones are decreasing. Anyway, what works to prevent stoned driving? Same thing that prevents drunk driving. Education doesn't work very well, especially for pot smokers, because they all think they're fine. The effect is minimal. They know how to drive. They can compensate. The threat of punishment works for drunk drivers too. That's roadside testing really would decrease stoned driving. The other problem is marijuana use at work. Employers are concerned about people operating machines, work performance, attendance. And we know in Washington, Oregon, Colorado, 1 in 4 marijuana users actually report getting high before or during work. This is my favorite study. 1985, they did this research with airline pilots, and they had them smoke one joint, and they tested them before on a flight simulator. They didn't use real 747s. They used a flight simulator. It looks like it. But anyway, they tested them before they smoked pot. They tested them 24 hours later, not the next morning, 24 hours later. And what they found is they had more difficulty aligning with and landing on the runway. The lateral deviation was twice the pre-marijuana test. One pilot missed the runway entirely. And when they asked them, the pilots all said they were fine. They were not affected at all. They were not aware of any impairment. And this applies to everything. It applies to employees. It applies to driving. I would tell you it applies to me. When I was in college, I was really good. I studied at night and then smoked pot afterwards. What I didn't realize is that it's a long-acting drug, and it interfered with my ability to learn. I had no idea. Now I realize that it did. I would have had a much better college career had it not been for marijuana. So this finding really applies very widely to a lot of people. I mean, everybody. And it's that marijuana denial. It didn't affect me. It doesn't affect me. Workplace problems. This is a study published in JAMA. It was done at the post office. It was people who tested positive on a pre-employment screen for marijuana. They still got hired. It's not that they're using marijuana at work. All they know is they use it outside of work. Compared to non-users, more accidents, more discipline, more turnover, more sick days, more injuries. This is a cute study. Anybody who has ever used marijuana can completely identify with this study. THC makes rats lazy and less willing to try a cognitively demanding test. And what they did is they trained rats to get lumps of sugar. And they could do it two ways. One was really easy. There was a bar that was always there that they could press and get one little lump. And then there was a very complicated task where there's only a brief period of time. They had to press it right then, but they'd get a whole bunch of sugar. And then they divided rats into 3 groups, gave one CBD, one placebo, and one THC. And the ones that got CBD and placebo, they kept doing the really complicated task. The ones that got THC did the really easy task. This similar study done in humans, it was done in college students, and they found that marijuana users had less initiative and less persistence. But on the whole issue of marijuana in the workplace, there was also deceptive research. I found this one. It's called The Effects of Medical Marijuana on Sickness Absence. And he studied and he found that absenteeism decreased in medical marijuana states. And so he concluded that medical marijuana laws will save employers money. Well, the study was done when absenteeism was decreasing all across the country. This is a graph of absenteeism. From 2006 to 2014, it dropped almost in half. I don't know exactly why, but it dropped just as much in non-medical marijuana states as medical marijuana states. Again, a study with absolutely no controls. He found a trend and pretended that marijuana caused it. Okay, so this is the study that bothers me the most. There's been a rash of news stories about this, how medical marijuana could help end the opioid epidemic. And because this has serious consequences. So here it is in the conservative Newsmax. Tucker Carlson ran it, and what he's saying is not true. Opioid abuse did not plummet. What is true is what this billboard put up by the marijuana industry says. States that legalize marijuana had 25% fewer opioid-related deaths. That is true. And it is based on, there's actually 6 studies I found. There's probably more. They're putting them out all the time. And these studies found that states with medical marijuana laws had 25% fewer overdose deaths, 42% fewer prescriptions, fewer hospitalizations, I mean, it's really dramatic. And I look at that, I go, that would be an amazing result for such a tiny intervention. But if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And all these studies make the exact same mistake, which is correlation does not prove causation. All they have found is a correlation. And a really good study goes out of its way to figure out if there's a third factor. They test all these other confounding factors to see. None of these studies did that. In fact, 3 of these studies were done by this guy, David Bradford, who's printed a very pro-marijuana op-ed, and he actually openly comes to the conclusion that it's causal when there's no evidence that there is. So when 2 things are correlated, it could be, one could cause the other. It could also be pure coincidence. Maybe a third factor causes both. And so I want to just show you that. So here is the blue line is the divorce rate in Maine. The red line is the per capita consumption of margarine. Highly correlated. This is pure coincidence, I think. I doubt that one causes the other. There's another one. I love this. J. Edgar Hoover once actually said that trailer parks are a major cause of crime. They are not. Substance abuse causes crime. Substance abuse causes people to have poor finances so they can only afford to live in a trailer park. So substance abuse is that third factor or alternative explanation that causes both people to live in trailer parks and to be involved in crime. A really good study on trailer parks and crime would say we found them highly correlated, but after we adjusted for this confounding factor of substance abuse, the correlation disappeared. J. Edgar Hoover didn't do that. So we have a third factor on the whole opioid overdose medical marijuana thing. And the third factor is the U.S. has, back especially the first decade of this century, an epidemic of fatal overdoses concentrated in whites without a college degree. In fact, particularly non-Hispanic whites without a college degree. That's who was dying of opioid overdoses. And here's a map of the United States showing bachelor's degrees. And the ones with the lowest number of bachelor's degrees are the ones in yellow and really light green. And you can see Nevada's there, but Nevada's highly Hispanic. I'm going to skip Idaho, but all the rest of them are Oklahoma, 7 southern states, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia. These are the states with the highest number of non-Hispanic whites without a college degree. And here's a graph, here's a map of the states with the highest number of opioid prescriptions. I mean, look at these. It is, you look at it's harder to see in this one, but you look at those states there, it's the same states. And so these are the states with the highest number of opioid prescriptions. It's not caused by marijuana. It's caused because they have high percentage of the non-Hispanic whites who were the victims of the opioid epidemic. What else do we know about non-Hispanic, non-college educated whites is that they tend to vote conservative. And so conservative states are the last states to pass a medical marijuana law. So the reason they don't have medical marijuana laws is also caused by that. So it's a third factor causing both. What else I want to say about that? So the whole thing is deceptive. You know, they took a trend and they claimed that marijuana caused it, when in fact marijuana has nothing to do with it. But this one has really serious consequences because there are states passing laws saying that marijuana can be used to treat opioid addiction. And I've got patients who believe it. And so this is what we see. And the news media has gone along with this in a really tricky way. They don't come out and say that it works because they know darn well that there's no research saying that. They always pose it as a question. So they say, can medical marijuana help? Can legal marijuana solve the opioid crisis? Hey, we're not saying that it does. You know, we're just asking the question. Is marijuana a secret weapon against the opioid epidemic? But what the public hears is story after story saying pot can help opioid addicts. Here's Charles Koch saying this. Is marijuana the solution? Fox News, could marijuana help treat painkiller addiction? Now, you got to tell you, when so many news outlets do the exact same misleading thing, this is an orchestrated campaign. And this has been a huge media campaign designed to convince us that marijuana can help opioid addiction. And the research shows that this is not true. There's a good study that came out, American Journal of Psychiatry, 2017, pain patients who used marijuana after several years were more likely to be abusing opioids, not less likely. Opioid abusers who used marijuana were more likely to continue abusing opioids, not less likely. It's the opposite of what they're claiming here. Here's some more studies on this. Women in methadone treatment who use marijuana, 82% more likely to relapse to heroin, not less likely. Patients in opioid treatment who use marijuana, more likely to drop out. So marijuana makes it harder for addicts to get off opioids, not easier. I think it makes, for my patients, it seems to make it worse. I think people do much better off it, and this is what the research shows. I want to bring up another way that marijuana affects opioids, and it's something that is called the gateway effect. A dozen studies have shown that teenage marijuana users are more likely to abuse illicit drugs. Marijuana use always comes first. 96% of illicit drug users start with marijuana. And so what? It's a correlation. It doesn't show causation. And there's very good alternative explanations for this. And so the news media has been very good at saying the gateway drug it's a myth. It's not. And the alternative explanations are marijuana users self-select, and the sort of people who would choose to use marijuana are also more likely to use other drugs, and that is true. Also, marijuana users are hanging out with a bunch of druggies, so they're more likely to be exposed to other drugs, and that is also true. But the gateway effect also has a biological component. And the thing is, you can't take a bunch of 12-year-olds and say, okay, you guys are going to use marijuana, you guys aren't. Totally, you can't do that stuff. But you can do it with rats, and it's been done. And so they randomly assign rats, and there's no peer pressure on rats. They're not using because their friends are using. And so they gave half the rats as teenagers, they gave them THC, and the other half they didn't. And then when they grew up, they gave them heroin. And the ones that got THC used more heroin and used it more often. And the view is that it sensitizes the opioid receptors. There's other research that shows that. And this is a problem because we've got 500,000 kids in Canada, the United States, under the age of 16 who are using marijuana. And they run the risk of altering their brains to enjoy opiates for the rest of their lives. And it could play a role in the heroin epidemic. Another study shows that teenage marijuana users are more likely to go into hard drugs. Yeah, we know that's the old gateway story. But it's the teenage users who did it in their early teens, before the age of 14. We've seen that before when the brain development is going through its biggest period. If the problem is that they're smoking pot and they're hanging out with people using other drugs, and that's what gets them into the other drugs, you'd see it more in the older ones, because those are the people more likely to be using other drugs. But we don't. We see it in the very youngest, and these are people who are using when they're usually not exposed to the harder drugs. Some other studies on marijuana and the link to opioids. Fetuses of women who use marijuana during pregnancy have more mu-opioid receptor activity in the amygdala, which is part of the reward pathway. In other words, using marijuana during pregnancy, the offspring are going to be, they're going to have sensitized opioid receptors, more prone to use opioids and enjoy them. And here's the two studies that should bother people the most. Female rats treated with THC as adolescents who mated later had offspring whose brain had a stronger response to morphine. They had more mu-opioid receptors in the nucleus accumbens. I just know that's part of the reward pathway. And this one is even a little worse. Female rats, again treated with THC as adolescents, mated later, had offspring who, when offered, used more heroin. So what it's saying is using marijuana in your early teens could make your children more prone to heroin addiction, at least in rats. We don't know. We don't have a test saying it's in people. But it's, nobody is warning teenage girls about this. And it could play a role in the opioid problem. So there's a lot of things saying marijuana could be could be making the opioid epidemic worse. And you look at this, what caused the opioid pain reliever epidemic? Senator Claire McCaskill put it really easy. She said, this epidemic is the direct result of a calculating sales and marketing strategy by major opioid manufacturers. And I'll tell you, I used to tell patients that opioids do not work for chronic pain. You just build up more opioid receptors, you have the same pain plus you're on opioids. Yes.
You had showed the slide about 3 times more likely to continue with the opiates.
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain the reason then physicians seem to overlook positive marijuana screenings in like MAC clinics?
Lack of information. I worked in a clinic and they told the guy who ran it said, don't talk to people about their marijuana use. This is a trained addiction psychiatrist. It's denial. It's, we used to do this without, I remember, I was a doctor back in the 80s. I was told, don't talk to your patients about their drinking. Talk to them about their real psychiatric problems. They're wrong. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I always talk to I've been talking to patients about their drinking. I talk to every single patient about their cigarette use. I talk to patients about their marijuana use, and they're simply wrong to do it. They don't want to argue. I don't know what else to say about them. And the doctor who told me to do this, he ran a for-profit clinic. Didn't want to chase patients away. Anyway, back to what the drug companies did. I used to tell pain patients, opioids don't work for chronic pain. In the 90s, there was a huge pressure on us to prescribe opioids for chronic pain. It was in journals, it was in conferences, and it was a lie. Here's this article in Scientific American. I mean, read this. The tragedy of needless pain. Contrary to popular belief, this author says morphine taken solely to control pain is not addictive. Yet patients worldwide continue to be undertreated and to suffer unnecessary agony. This is a scientific expert. This guy was a researcher, and it's a lie. And he was sponsored by the drug companies. So let me be more explicit about what's going on here. What the drug companies did is they paid scientific experts to produce deceptive research that they then used to tell doctors and the public that opioids work well to treat chronic pain when the opposite is true. Right now, the marijuana industry has been convincing scientific experts to produce deceptive research about opioids and marijuana so they can tell doctors and the public that marijuana works well to treat opioid addiction when most likely the opposite is true. I think this plays a role in the ongoing heroin epidemic. My patients, my heroin addicted patients, they either have a family history of addiction or they use pot before the age of 14. That's my experience. I don't know if there's any studies on that, but okay. Briefly, I want to talk about cannabidiol. Cannabidiol is a non-addictive part of marijuana, and the big problem with cannabidiol is that it almost always contains THC because of the way it's made. If you want pure cannabidiol, you get it from GW Pharma that made a PDLX, or you get it from certain companies that will make pure cannabidiol. But most people who use cannabidiol buy cheaper stuff that has THC in it and shows up positive on drug screens, and it's actually having an effect on it. In some cases, but anyway, it does help. It does seem to help with opioid addiction. So here's a study. Rats were trained to like morphine and cocaine, and then they were given CBD and offered morphine and cocaine, and they lost their interest in the morphine, but not the cocaine, which is pretty cool. I mean, a drug that actually decreases opioid craving. Now note that they use CBD from a bioscience company that makes neurochemicals. They did not get CBD from a dispensary, which contains THC. Here's another study. Absent heroin addicts receive CBD or placebo, and they show them these videos to trigger cravings. An hour later, a day later, 7 days later. And for all 7 days, they actually had less cravings. That's pretty impressive. Again, they use a PDLX from GW Pharma, not dispensary CBD. They use pure CBD with no THC in it. But when the news media reports on this, that is not what they tell people. So this is about that research. But look what the headline says. A neurobiologist says medical marijuana could solve the U.S. opioid crisis. They don't even mention CBD until the fourth paragraph. They never mention the PDLX that was actually used. They keep saying medical marijuana. The news media is really pushing misinformation on this. This happened locally. I called up KJazz. They're down in Phoenix because they ran this whole thing. Could medical marijuana offer promise to treat opioid addiction? They interviewed the person who did one of these studies. The entire story was about research on CBD, not marijuana, but they present it as medical marijuana. The press is using CBD to promote marijuana. So where am I? Basically, about marijuana being approved, I say the FDA is right not to approve it. I mean, suppose the FDA approved a drug that increased traffic fatalities, increased workplace injuries, caused 500,000 kids to do worse in school, doubled the dropout rate, increased the number of suicides, caused psychotic disorders, was linked to violence, possibly even mass shootings, and predisposed people to heroin addiction. They would have a hard time explaining that to Congress. So my belief is, we look at this. Apparently. Criteria for approving a medicine. Let's just get back to this. Has a medical benefit. Marijuana definitely has a medical benefit. No serious side effects. It has huge side effects. Marijuana has side effects. Medical marijuana laws have side effects. The side effect of medical marijuana laws is diversion and increased use. That's what the laws seem to cause. And then that causes all the problems with marijuana. So unless it works so much better than the alternatives, it shouldn't be approved. And the fact is, we have prescription cannabinoids that do everything that marijuana does. If they spent 1/10 of the time, money, and energy legalizing medical marijuana, if they instead spent that getting the price down on the prescription cannabinoids and teaching doctors how to use them and prescribe them appropriately and not prescribe them inappropriately, we would have no need for medical marijuana laws. So my conclusion is the best way to deliver cannabinoid treatment is use the FDA prescribed medicine. I just want to take a couple minutes and talk about what I actually say to patients, because I deal with all sorts of patients who use marijuana. Normally they say motivational interviewing is the best, but there's so much misinformation out there that I think just giving people good information. And so I try to say, a lot of the patients are very open to it. A lot of patients who use marijuana say, I had no idea it caused depression. A lot of them are very resistant and get very angry at just anything. So what I like to say is, look, you're allowed to do whatever you want. I'm not prescribing, but allow me to be the person who reports on good information. You've got to hear the good information. And I happen to know, because I remember what I was like. If anybody told me anything bad about pot, I totally blew it off. But I remember everybody. I remember the people who did. So that information got through. So I just try to be very neutral, factual, and informative. I respect their right to use drugs. I actually do think people have the right to use drugs. They also have the right to get clean and sober. I have a firm conviction that everybody's happier off addictive drugs, and I try to get all my patients off them. And like I said, if they get defensive and angry, I just say, look, let me play the role of this information. You're allowed to do whatever you want. I do remind them that it's a long-acting drug. And so, when I ask people, how often do you use it? And they say, oh, hardly ever, maybe 3 times a week. I say, that's quite a bit. Or they say, oh, I just use it at night. I go, so you use it every day. I try to reframe it that way. Because they don't know that that's a lot. They don't really realize that. I also tell patients that medical marijuana laws are almost entirely a scam, and most of them agree with me. I tell them about the long-term side effects. I tell them the research says it does not help addiction. The research I've looked at says it does not. Some says it helps PTSD, but mostly it doesn't. It definitely does not help anxiety and depression. It'll trigger your opioid receptors and increase craving. It makes it harder to quit. It's just the information. I just give them the information out of the research because they're not hearing it. It's not in the news. I tell them addicts who use marijuana will relapse more often. They find it harder to quit. It makes PTSD worse. It causes panic attacks. It causes depression. It makes people suicidal. And they hear it. And it's information that they need to have. And I also say when it does work for pain, but non-addictive pain medicines might work as well. Have you tried gabapentin? How does ibuprofen work? It does help sleep, but if you use an addictive drug for sleep, you never get better. If you really want to get on a non-addictive streak, and I do this with Ambien too. I try to get everybody off Ambien, and especially if they're using it every night. I say, if you can get to where you're not using it every night, you won't build up a tolerance. That's true with Ambien. It's really not true with pot, but anything to get them there. I try to be very friendly, not at all confrontative. I smile as I tell them this stuff. But I say it as if, of course, this is information that you would want to have. And actually, I think that they do. I do believe that people have the right to use and abuse drugs. I also believe they have the right to good information. And I talk about my own marijuana use a lot. I don't know if it helps that much, but I think for some people it does. When I was younger, it helped more. The really addicted, hostile marijuana user, and marijuana causes anger. I mean, some of the most hostile patients I've seen are marijuana users. I tell them, look, my patients who use medical marijuana almost all have a history of substance abuse. They genuinely believe it helps. It probably does help. But I think the reason they choose marijuana is more the addiction talking. And my other experience is all of my patients, especially if you use medical marijuana for something psychiatric, they do better when they're off of it. They'll call me judgmental. They'll insist that marijuana helps. They said they've quit before and they did worse when they quit. I go, look, I've seen lots of people insist that it helps. Always, when they get off the drug, they actually do better. It's your decision. In my experience, it's what causes the irritability and the agitation. It's not the cure for it. Just like alcoholics who thought they drank because they were depressed. And I also say, once people start using marijuana again, they actually do not remember how they felt when they were not using it. If you say it out of concern, people hear it. Like I said, even if they're not listening today, they will hear it later. On addictive medicines in general, this is just my belief. I believe addictive medicine should be a drug of last resort. I believe helping people get off addictive medicines is always a good thing, not forcing, but helping. I usually tell patients, look, I'm going to treat your panic attacks to the point that you don't need the Xanax and you're going to stop it on your own. Giving addictive medicine to someone with a substance use disorder or family history of addiction should be avoided whenever possible. It's interesting. In my experience, I see a lot of patients who, because I do the MAT part, and a lot of patients come to me who've never had a substance use problem in their life, but their doctor put them on opioids and they got addicted to it. They didn't get addicted, they became physically dependent. And I really stress it with them. You're not addicted. You never did drug seeking, you never lied to get it, you didn't buy it on the street. They're kind of amazing. When their doctor stops them, they just go through withdrawal because doctor's orders. My experience is every one of them has a strong family history of alcoholism. And I think that's what primed them to get so dependent on it. People without that family history of alcoholism, I think, get off the opioids very easily. Anyway, that's it. Are there other questions? A few minutes.
So you never came back to my question from earlier.
Okay.
We know that some of the metabolites stay active for 30 days, but the THC is the one we're worried about. How long does it stay active?
Oh, yeah, I don't know exactly how long. I think it's actually fairly short, but I don't know. I know that pilot study shows whatever's in there is affecting them for at least 24 hours. And we know with the driving fatalities, that metabolite seems to go within less than 24 hours. So the metabolite that's most seriously cause of stone driving accidents leaves pretty quickly. But we don't know what the other metabolites do. There's this one study where they looked at high school students who use drugs and alcohol, and when they quit or cut down on the drugs, their school attendance improved, except for marijuana. And school attendance did not improve until they had been completely off marijuana for 3 months. So something is staying around. And I remember when I quit, certain things changed after 3 months. So I don't think we have the answer on that. The most serious metabolite is out pretty quickly. But that pilot study shows that something else is going on. That was a question about how long the metabolites last. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just to preface, I agree as far as youth and the use of that for young people, and I would say across the board with many substances, even psychiatric medications, developing brains. I think, and I asked you earlier, sort of it being marijuana being a Schedule I drug. Do you believe that it is scheduled appropriately?
Yeah, the question is, should marijuana be a Schedule I drug? And my first response is, we have this onslaught right now of people who want to sell drugs and make money. and they're starting with marijuana, although they've let us know they're going to push into other drugs as well. And they are targeting teenagers, and it is a huge fight. And as long as this is going on, I'm opposed to giving them anything. That's part of it. The other part is, the question is, Schedule 1 is no medical use. And the fact is, there's no medical reason to use marijuana. We've got prescription cannabinoids. It's the same thing with opium itself. I mean, we make huge numbers of medications out of opium, but opium itself is still Schedule 1. So it's not really a question of how dangerous it is. It's just a question of, is there medical use for that? And the Schedule 1 means that, I think it's an important drug to stop because it is causing a lot of problems. And keeping it Schedule 1 makes it easier to, if anybody is caught with it, they have no excuse for having it. And it makes it much easier to stop. Same with opium. People are caught with opium. There's no excuse for them having it. Cocaine is available, I think, only in hospitals. So anybody caught with cocaine can't claim that it's medical use.
So you find that to be more politically driven?
Which part?
The fact that it's Schedule 1 and compared to things like meth, which is Schedule
Well, this is the whole idea that, marijuana is a safer drug. It is not a safer drug. The schizophrenia and the violence things are actually quite real. It's just not getting reported in the press. It's this marijuana denial. Oh, it's only weed. It's a safer drug. It's that's pot denial, and it's pot denial that's coming through the press, and we're not getting the information. But I don't think it is politically driven. I think this decision was made 100 years ago. At the time, it's the same time. Alex Berenson points out that Mexico made marijuana illegal before the United States did, because it was much more widely used there, and they saw far more problems with it. And the United States actually followed Mexico. I think it was, at the time, they were, back in the, 100 years ago, Bayer Pharmaceutical came out with heroin as a cough suppressant. And that's what really a big part of what motivated these laws. They were saying, people are selling these patent drugs that are really quite dangerous and addictive. And there was a lot of reports of problems with marijuana at that time. So that's why it became illegal.
And that was my next point, because in your first part, you talked about, Nixon and this idea of the war on drugs. And to speak to him, he did put a lot more money into treatment and coined the term the war on drugs, which stays with us. And you talked about minorities being targeted, but that they are arrested more often. But there was an interesting quote that came out, which I'm sure you're familiar with, from his, it was actually,
It's not from John Ehrlichman. It's from somebody who claimed that he interviewed John Ehrlichman and reports on it after Ehrlichman died. Yeah. Right. And he said that Nixon hated hippies and blacks, and that's why he did it. But this quote has never been reported in a reputable news source that I know of. Somebody came out with it after Ehrlichman had died. There's no way to prove it or disprove it. I don't think it's true, because Nixon hated everybody. I don't think he particularly hated blacks and hippies more than anybody else. He was mad at people protesting his war. He hated people who caused problems for him. That was pretty much it. But he actually, in a sense, he's the one who actually resolved a heroin epidemic that mostly struck inner city blacks. So he did a pretty good thing on that. So I don't think that thing is true. I've read it too. Any other questions? Okay. If anybody wants the PowerPoint, get a hold of Vicki. Thanks all for coming.